They built it on a quiet hill, outside a city of poets and philosophers where birds still sang in the trees, and the world pretended nothing was wrong. And then behind barbed wire and watchtowers, human beings began to disappear. Not all at once, not in gas chambers, but slowly, deliberately, day by day. At Buchenwald, death did not rush. It waited. It starved. It beat. It infected. It worked men until their bodies simply stopped responding. This was a camp where suffering had no schedule and mercy had no place, where prisoners built their own cages and learned that survival itself could become a crime. You could arrive healthy and strong and still be dead within months. Not because you were sentenced, but because the system decided you were no longer useful. Here, children age into ghosts, doctors became executioners, and hope was something you learned to hide so it wouldn't be taken from you. This is not a story about one massacre or one moment of horror. This is the story of endless suffering, engineered, perfected, and hidden in plain sight, on a hill called Ettersberg, in a place the world would come to know as Buchenwald. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The Birth of a Camp of Control, 1937. Buchenwald concentration camp did not emerge from chaos or sudden wartime panic. It was born from planning, ideology, and intent. In the summer of 1937, 4 years before the gas chambers of Auschwitz would begin operating, the Nazi regime chose a forested hill called Ettersberg, just 8 kilometers from the city of Weimar, to construct a new kind of camp, one that would serve as a permanent instrument of political repression and social control. The location was deliberate and symbolic. Weimar was internationally known as the birthplace of German humanism, associated with figures like Goethe and Schiller, a city of art, literature, and philosophy. By placing a concentration camp within sight of this cultural heart, the Nazi state sent an unspoken message. No tradition, no legacy, no moral inheritance would stand above the new order. Terror would coexist openly with culture, normalized and hidden in plain sight. Buchenwald was established during a critical transition in the Nazi system of camps. Earlier camps such as Dachau had been created primarily to imprison political opponents. Communists, social democrats, trade unionists. After Hitler's rise to power in 1933. By 1937, however, the Nazi state had consolidated control, and the camp system began to evolve from temporary detention centers into permanent institutions of repression. Buchenwald was designed from the beginning to be large, expandable, and enduring. It was not improvised. It was engineered. SS planners selected the site, surveyed the land, and designed a layout that emphasized surveillance, hierarchy, and psychological domination. The camp would not merely confine prisoners. It would reshape them through discipline, fear, and labor. The first prisoners arrived before the camp was fully built. They were primarily German political prisoners, communists, social democrats, and others labeled as enemies of the state. These men were forced to construct the very camp that would imprison them. They cleared forests, erected barbed wire fences, built barracks, laid roads, and installed watchtowers under SS supervision. From the beginning, forced labor and punishment were inseparable. Beatings were routine. Food was scarce. Exhaustion was constant. The camp's physical structure became a daily reminder of domination. Roll call squares designed for hours-long assemblies in all weather, barracks arranged to maximize control, and an electrified fence that marked the boundary between life under terror and a death that could be triggered instantly by a single step. Buchenwald's command structure reflected the broader SS philosophy. The camp was run by professional SS officers who viewed prisoners not as human beings, but as units to be disciplined, exploited, and discarded. Violence was not random, it was systematic. Punishment regulations were codified. Prisoners could be flogged, hung by their arms, or confined in isolation cells for minor infractions or no infraction at all. Public punishment was encouraged as a means of collective intimidation. The goal was not only to hurt the individual but to break the group. Fear was meant to be contagious. From its earliest days, Buchenwald also introduced a hierarchy among prisoners themselves. The SS appointed certain inmates as prisoner functionaries, capos, block elders, and labor supervisors, often selecting criminals or those willing to cooperate. This system deliberately blurred the line between victim and enforcer. It forced prisoners into moral traps, compelling some to participate in the oppression of others in exchange for slightly better food, clothing, or survival. By outsourcing control in this way, the SS reduced the need for constant direct supervision while deepening mistrust and fragmentation among the imprisoned population. It was an early demonstration of how domination could be maintained not only through brute force, but through manipulation of social structures. The categories of prisoners at Buchenwald quickly expanded. Alongside political prisoners came so-called socialists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, homosexual men, and others deemed undesirable by Nazi racial and social ideology. Each group was marked with a colored triangle sewn onto their uniforms, transforming identity into a visible code. Names disappeared, replaced by numbers. Individual histories were erased, replaced by classifications that determined labor assignments, treatment, and chances of survival. This bureaucratic reduction of human beings into categories was a defining feature of Buchenwald from the start, and a preview of what would later be scaled across the entire camp system. By the end of its first year, Buchenwald was already overcrowded, violent, and deadly. Disease spread easily in poorly built barracks. Food rations were insufficient, deliberately calculated to weaken bodies without causing immediate mass death. Medical care existed largely in name only. The camp was functioning exactly as intended, not as a place of swift execution, but as a sustained environment of suffering. Prisoners were meant to be worn down physically and psychologically over time, their usefulness extracted until nothing remained. What made Buchenwald especially significant in the Nazi system was its role as a model. SS officers trained there would later be transferred to other camps. Administrative practices tested at Buchenwald, record-keeping, punishment systems, labor deployment, and prisoner hierarchies, would be exported across Germany and eventually occupied Europe. In this sense, Buchenwald was not just a camp, it was a laboratory of repression. Long before the Holocaust reached its most industrialized phase, Buchenwald demonstrated how a modern state could normalize cruelty through organization, routine, and law. By 1938, as Nazi persecution intensified and Germany moved closer to war, Buchenwald stood ready, expanded, disciplined, and integrated into the machinery of the Third Reich. What had begun as a camp for political enemies was becoming something far larger, a central pillar in a system that would soon engulf millions. The foundations were laid not only in concrete and wire, but in ideology and obedience. And once those foundations were set, the suffering they enabled would last for years. Chapter 1, Segment 2. From Political Prison to Social Weapon. By late 1937 and into 1938, Buchenwald concentration camp had moved beyond its original purpose as a holding site for political opponents and was transforming into a far more complex instrument of Nazi rule. This shift did not happen suddenly or accidentally. It followed the steady radicalization of the Third Reich itself, as ideology hardened into policy and persecution expanded from organized political resistance to entire categories of society deemed dangerous, inferior, or disposable. The camp's population changed rapidly, and with it, the methods of control grew more refined, more systematic, and more brutal. What emerged was a controlled environment where suffering was not merely inflicted, but carefully managed, prolonged, and normalized as part of everyday routine. The year 1938 marked a turning point. Following events such as the Anschluss with Austria and the escalation of anti-Semitic laws inside Germany, mass arrests surged. Thousands of new prisoners poured into Buchenwald, including Jews, Roma, so-called socialists, repeat offenders, and men accused of violating racial or moral codes. Many were arrested without trial, without formal charges, and without any expectation of release. Protective custody, Schutzhaft, became the legal fiction that allowed the SS to imprison anyone indefinitely. Courts were sidelined. Law became irrelevant. The camp itself replaced the justice system, operating as a closed world where the SS decided guilt, punishment, and survival. Inside the camp, daily life was structured to strip away individuality and replace it with absolute obedience. Prisoners were woken before dawn, forced into roll call assemblies that could last for hours, regardless of weather. Standing still became an ordeal. Any movement could invite punishment. Any collapse could mean death. These roll calls were not simply administrative. They were exercises in humiliation and control, designed to demonstrate that time, body, and dignity no longer belonged to the prisoner. The SS watched silently as men swayed, fainted, or froze, learning that mercy was absent and weakness was dangerous. Labor assignments became the core mechanism through which Buchenwald functioned. Prisoners were sent to quarries, workshops, construction details, and later to armaments-related labor as Germany prepared for war. Work was deliberately exhausting and often pointless. Productivity mattered less than submission. Tools were scarce, safety non-existent, and exhaustion constant. Accidents were common, but they were rarely treated as accidents. Injury often meant punishment, and illness could be interpreted as sabotage. In this system, the line between labor and execution blurred. Death did not need to be immediate. It was sufficient that it was inevitable. Violence permeated every aspect of camp life, yet it followed patterns that made it predictable, and therefore even more terrifying. Guards enforced discipline with beatings, whips, and rifle butts, but prisoners also learned that punishment could arrive without warning. A misstep, a glance, an incorrect posture could trigger brutality. This unpredictability destroyed any sense of safety or logic. Over time, prisoners internalized fear, policing their own movements and thoughts in an effort to survive. Terror became self-sustaining, requiring fewer direct interventions from the SS as prisoners learned to anticipate pain. Medical care at Buchenwald existed primarily to maintain labor output, not to heal. Doctors were SS officers who viewed prisoners as expendable material. Sick inmates were often returned to work prematurely or left untreated. Those deemed unfit were isolated, punished, or quietly removed from the population. From early on, medical neglect became a form of slow killing. Starvation weakened immune systems. Overcrowding spread disease. The camp hospital, such as it was, functioned less as a place of recovery and more as a sorting area between those who might return to labor and those who would not. The prisoner hierarchy deepened during this period. Criminal prisoners, marked with green triangles, were often elevated to positions of authority over political prisoners and others. This was a calculated SS strategy. By placing power in the hands of those more likely to enforce discipline harshly, the SS intensified internal violence while maintaining plausible distance. Prisoners were forced into impossible choices: cooperate and survive at the expense of others, or resist and risk death. Solidarity became dangerous. Trust was rare. The system fractured human relationships, turning survival into a lonely, morally corrosive struggle. Psychological terror was as central as physical abuse. Public executions, hangings, and punishments were staged as spectacles. Prisoners were forced to watch, to learn, to absorb the message that resistance was futile and life was conditional. Silence became a survival strategy. Emotions were suppressed. Hope itself became risky because hope could be crushed. The camp trained prisoners not just to obey, but to expect nothing. By the end of 1938, Buchenwald had become a fully operational model of sustained suffering. It was no longer merely a place where enemies of the regime were held. It was a social weapon, designed to intimidate the broader population, eliminate perceived threats, and demonstrate the consequences of nonconformity. News of the camp traveled quietly through German society. People knew someone who had disappeared. People learned not to ask questions. Fear extended beyond the wire. This transformation marked Buchenwald's true significance in the Nazi system. It showed that terror did not require secrecy. It could exist openly, administratively, and indefinitely. The camp was functioning exactly as intended, not as an aberration, but as a permanent fixture of the new Germany. And as the regime moved closer to war, the lessons learned at Buchenwald, how to control, exhaust, and break human beings over time, would soon be applied on a far larger, far deadlier scale. Chapter 1, Segment 3. Engineering Obedience. How Terror Became Routine. By 1938 and early 1939, Buchenwald concentration camp had fully evolved into a functioning laboratory of controlled human suffering, where terror was no longer chaotic violence but an organized system embedded into daily life. What distinguished Buchenwald from earlier improvised detention sites was not only its size, but the deliberate way in which obedience was engineered over time. Every rule, every schedule, every punishment was designed to reshape human behavior, to erase autonomy and replace it with conditioned submission. The camp no longer relied on constant visible brutality alone. Instead, it taught prisoners to anticipate violence, to regulate themselves through fear, and to accept cruelty as the natural order of existence. The camp's physical layout itself reinforced this transformation. The wide roll call square forced prisoners into open visibility, stripped of privacy and shelter. Barracks were overcrowded by design, eliminating personal space and fostering tension, exhaustion, and illness. Guard towers and barbed wire created a sense of omnipresent surveillance, even when no guard was visible. Prisoners learned quickly that control did not require constant oversight. The structure itself enforced discipline. Simply moving through the camp meant navigating a landscape built to remind inmates of their powerlessness at every step. Time inside Buchenwald was weaponized. Days were long, repetitive, and exhausting, yet unpredictable in their dangers. Roll calls could last minutes or hours. Meals arrived irregularly and in quantities insufficient to sustain life. Work details shifted without explanation. This distortion of time disoriented prisoners, breaking their ability to plan, hope, or measure endurance. The future shrank to the next hour, the next command, the next breath. Survival became an exercise in moment-to-moment adaptation, not long-term resistance. Punishment followed a grim logic that prisoners gradually learned but could never master. Infractions were often vague or invented. A crooked cap, a slow response, an exhausted stumble. Any could result in beatings, isolation, or execution. This uncertainty was intentional. By making rules impossible to fully obey, the SS ensured that every prisoner was always guilty of something. Innocence ceased to exist as a concept. Guilt became a permanent state, reinforcing the idea that suffering was deserved and unavoidable. Public punishments played a crucial psychological role. Executions, floggings, and humiliations were staged in full view of other inmates. Prisoners were forced to watch, to stand silently, to internalize the lesson being delivered. These spectacles were not only about eliminating individuals, they were performances meant to educate the living. Each act of violence served as a warning that resistance, spoken or silent, would be answered swiftly and publicly. Over time, fear spread faster than any order. Prisoners began correcting each other, enforcing discipline among themselves in an effort to avoid collective punishment. Terror became decentralized, embedded within the prisoner population itself. Food deprivation was another carefully calibrated tool. Rations were designed not simply to starve, but to weaken gradually. Hunger dulled concentration, slowed movement, and eroded physical resistance. It also destroyed solidarity. Bread became currency. Soup became leverage. Acts of kindness carried unbearable costs. The struggle for calories overshadowed ideology, identity, and memory. The body's needs eclipsed the mind's capacity for resistance, reducing existence to a biological contest that the SS controlled completely. Disease spread rapidly under these conditions, especially typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and exhaustion ensured that illness was constant. Yet disease was not treated as a problem to be solved. It was tolerated, even welcomed, as another mechanism of attrition. The sick were isolated, neglected, or worked until collapse. Medical care existed only to preserve labor efficiency, not human life. In many cases, being visibly ill marked a prisoner as disposable. Survival required appearing strong even when the body was failing. The SS also refined psychological classification systems that would later be used across the Nazi camp network. Prisoners were divided by colored triangles, categories that defined not only how guards treated them, but how prisoners treated one another. Political prisoners, Jews, Roma, criminals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others were deliberately separated and ranked. This hierarchy prevented unity. It encouraged suspicion, rivalry, and resentment. Solidarity, one of the few remaining tools of survival, was systematically undermined. Children and adolescents imprisoned at Buchenwald experienced a uniquely cruel distortion of development. They were forced into adult labor, exposed to constant violence, and denied education or protection. Childhood disappeared behind barbed wire. For many, the camp became their first and only teacher, instructing them in fear, obedience, and loss. The presence of children suffering alongside hardened political prisoners underscored the camp's purpose. No one was too young to be broken. By this stage, Buchenwald was no longer simply responding to perceived threats. It was proactively shaping the future of Nazi terror. SS officers trained here would later take their methods to other camps, refining systems of punishment, labor exploitation, and psychological control. The camp functioned as a prototype not only of suffering but of administrative cruelty. Violence was documented, scheduled, categorized, and improved upon. Terror became bureaucratic. What made this phase of Buchenwald especially dangerous was its normalization. Guards went home after shifts. Paperwork was filed. Orders were stamped and archived. Within the logic of the camp, atrocity was routine. This normalization extended beyond the barbed wire, embedding itself in the broader machinery of the Nazi state. Buchenwald demonstrated that mass suffering could be sustained indefinitely without secrecy, chaos, or constant bloodshed. It could be managed calmly, efficiently, and legally, at least within the regime's own moral universe. As Germany moved closer to war, the lessons learned at Buchenwald would prove invaluable to the SS. The camp had shown how to destroy people slowly, predictably, and systematically. It had proven that terror did not need to shock forever, it only needed to be consistent. And in mastering that lesson, Buchenwald became far more than a prison. It became a warning of what happens when cruelty is organized, normalized, and allowed to operate without restraint. Chapter 2, Segment 1. Expansion of Suffering. Buchenwald and the Normalization of Forced Labor. By the outbreak of the Second World War, Buchenwald concentration camp had entered a new and far more destructive phase of its existence. What began as a political terror camp was steadily transformed into a central component of Nazi Germany's forced labor economy. This transformation did not occur overnight. It unfolded gradually, through bureaucratic decisions, economic pressures, and ideological justifications that reframed human beings not as prisoners, but as expendable units of labor. In this phase, suffering was no longer only a tool of punishment. It became productive, profitable, and essential to the war effort. As Germany rearmed and prepared for prolonged conflict, the SS faced a dual challenge: maintaining ideological terror while extracting maximum economic value from the growing prisoner population. Buchenwald was perfectly positioned for this shift. Its proximity to industrial regions, rail lines, and administrative centers made it an ideal hub for labor exploitation. Prisoners were no longer confined primarily to internal camp construction or maintenance. Instead, they were increasingly assigned to workshops, quarries, armament factories, and satellite labor sites scattered across central Germany. The camp expanded not just in size, but in function. Forced labor at Buchenwald was intentionally brutal. Prisoners worked long hours under constant supervision, often performing physically demanding tasks with inadequate tools, clothing, or nutrition. Exhaustion was not a side effect, it was part of the design. The SS calculated that a prisoner could be worked to the edge of collapse, replaced when no longer useful, and forgotten without consequence. Human life was measured in output and endurance, not dignity or survival. Those who faltered were beaten, demoted to harsher details, or sent to punishment blocks where recovery was impossible. The labor system also introduced a new layer of psychological control. Prisoners were forced to compete for marginally better assignments that might mean slightly more food or reduced exposure to violence. This competition fractured solidarity and deepened divisions already created by the camp's classification system. Survival increasingly depended not only on strength, but on navigating a moral minefield where helping another prisoner could endanger one's own life. The SS understood this dynamic well. By turning prisoners against one another through scarcity and privilege, the camp reduced the need for constant external force. Industrial firms quickly recognized the economic potential of concentration camp labor. Contracts were signed. Production quotas were set. Buchenwald became linked to the Nazi war economy in ways that blurred the line between state terror and private enterprise. Prisoners manufactured weapons, processed raw materials, and supported infrastructure critical to the Reich's military ambitions. Behind factory walls, the violence of the camp continued, less visible but no less lethal. Death from exhaustion, accidents, and untreated injuries became routine, logged as administrative losses rather than crimes. This phase marked a profound moral shift within the Nazi system. Killing was no longer always immediate or spectacular. Instead, it was deferred, disguised as productivity. Prisoners were allowed to live just long enough to be useful. Starvation rations were calibrated to sustain minimal labor capacity. Medical care was provided selectively, not to heal but to preserve output. The body became a machine maintained only until replacement was more efficient than repair. The expansion of labor also brought an influx of new prisoner groups. As Nazi occupation spread across Europe, Buchenwald received Jews, resistance fighters, civilians from occupied territories, and prisoners of war. Language barriers, cultural differences, and varying survival knowledge further fragmented the population. New arrivals were immediately subjected to the camp's brutal logic, often collapsing within weeks under conditions seasoned prisoners had learned, barely, to endure. The camp absorbed these human beings not as individuals but as raw material. Violence remained constant, but it evolved in form. Guards increasingly relied on prisoner functionaries, capos, to enforce discipline on labor details. This delegation of cruelty deepened moral injury across the camp. Prisoners were forced into roles that required them to harm others to survive themselves. The SS observed, intervened selectively, and preserved plausible distance. Responsibility became blurred, guilt diffused, and accountability erased. This system would later be replicated throughout the concentration camp network. By the early 1940s, Buchenwald had become a cornerstone of Nazi terror precisely because it functioned smoothly. It proved that mass suffering could be integrated into everyday economic life without disrupting the appearance of order. Trains arrived on time. Production reports were filed. Prisoners died quietly. The camp no longer needed constant spectacle to enforce control. Terror had been institutionalized, normalized, and embedded within routine operations. This stage of Buchenwald's history reveals a crucial truth about the Holocaust and the Nazi camp system as a whole. Genocide was not sustained by hatred alone. It was sustained by systems, by logistics, incentives, paperwork, and the gradual erosion of moral boundaries. At Buchenwald, forced labor demonstrated how a society could transform human beings into tools, then discard them without reflection. The camp did not simply destroy lives. It taught the regime how to make destruction efficient, invisible, and economically rational, lessons that would echo across Europe as the war intensified. Chapter 2, Segment 2. Terror as Routine, Discipline, Punishment, and the Architecture of Fear. As forced labor became the organizing principle of life inside Buchenwald, the system of punishment evolved alongside it, growing more calculated, more ritualized, and more psychologically devastating. Violence was no longer chaotic or impulsive. It became structured, woven into daily routines so deeply that prisoners could never separate work from fear or survival from obedience. Punishment was not merely a response to disobedience. It was a constant presence, designed to remind every inmate that their existence depended entirely on SS control. The camp did not rely on secrecy. It relied on visibility. Pain was meant to be seen, remembered, and internalized. The camp's disciplinary system operated on multiple levels at once. At the most visible level were public punishments. Beatings in the roll call square, hangings carried out before assembled prisoners, and executions staged as warnings. These spectacles were deliberate. Prisoners were forced to watch, often for hours, standing at attention while bodies swayed above them or blood soaked into the ground. The goal was not only to kill the condemned, but to imprint terror onto every witness. Survival required learning when to look away, when to stare, and when to appear unmoved, an impossible balance that slowly eroded the mind. Beyond public violence lay a complex network of hidden punishments. Solitary confinement, starvation cells, and standing cells, too small to sit or lie down, were used to break prisoners without leaving visible marks. Time lost meaning in these spaces. Hours blurred into days. Many emerged unable to stand, speak, or recognize themselves. Others never emerged at all. These punishments required no trial, no evidence, and no justification. An accusation from a guard or a capo was enough. The absence of rules was itself a rule, ensuring that no prisoner ever felt safe. Psychological terror proved as powerful as physical pain. Prisoners were never told the full extent of their sentence, their chances of release, or the reasons behind disciplinary decisions. Uncertainty became a weapon. Men and women lived in constant anticipation of violence, scanning every word, gesture, and expression for signs of danger. A misplaced glance, a moment of hesitation, or simple exhaustion could trigger punishment. Over time, Many prisoners began to police themselves more harshly than the guards ever could, internalizing fear until it shaped every thought. The SS understood that terror functioned best when delegated. Prisoner functionaries, block elders, work supervisors, and capos were granted limited authority in exchange for enforcing discipline. These individuals existed in a moral no man's land. To survive, they were often required to inflict suffering on others. Some embraced cruelty. Others complied reluctantly, attempting to soften blows when possible. But the system allowed no innocence. Every role carried guilt, and every decision risked death. By forcing prisoners to participate in their own oppression, the camp fractured solidarity and replaced it with suspicion and resentment. Punishment also reinforced the hierarchy imposed by the Nazi racial and political worldview. Certain groups were targeted with particular brutality. Political prisoners accused of resistance, Jews marked as racially inferior, and those labeled asocial or incorrigible. These categories determined access to food, work assignments, and medical care. They also dictated how punishment was applied. Some prisoners were beaten publicly. Others were worked to death quietly. The camp ensured that inequality was not only enforced, but constantly visible. Roll call appel became one of the most effective tools of control. Prisoners were forced to stand for hours, regardless of weather, illness, or injury, while SS guards counted and recounted bodies. The dead were dragged from barracks and propped upright to be counted among the living. Any discrepancy led to extended punishment. Roll call transformed bureaucracy into torture, turning a simple administrative task into a daily ordeal that reminded prisoners they were numbers before they were human. Medical abuse also intersected with punishment. Those deemed unfit for labor were often subjected to experiments or denied treatment altogether. Illness became a crime. Weakness was interpreted as defiance. Prison doctors, operating under SS authority, selected prisoners for experimentation or special treatment, a euphemism that concealed killing behind clinical language. The white coat did not represent healing. It represented another layer of control. Over time, terror achieved its intended effect. Resistance became dangerous not only because of SS retaliation, but because collective action was nearly impossible in an environment built on fear and fragmentation. Trust dissolved. Silence spread. Many prisoners survived by narrowing their world to the next hour, the next meal, the next breath. Hope became fragile, dangerous even. Yet despite this, terror never fully succeeded in erasing humanity. Acts of quiet defiance, sharing food, offering words of encouragement, remembering names, persisted beneath the surface. Small but significant rebellions against a system designed to erase identity. This segment of Buchenwald's history reveals how cruelty was transformed into routine. Punishment was no longer an exception. It was the rhythm of daily life. By embedding terror into every structure, labor, discipline, hierarchy, and administration, the camp ensured that violence required no explanation. It simply happened again and again until suffering felt inevitable. In doing so, Buchenwald became more than a place of imprisonment. It became a laboratory for domination, proving that fear, once normalized, could sustain a system of oppression with chilling efficiency. Chapter 2, Segment 3. Numbers, Names, and the Erasure of Identity. By the time the systems of labor and punishment had been fully established at Buchenwald, the camp had achieved something even more devastating than physical domination: the systematic erasure of individual identity. From the moment prisoners crossed the gates beneath the slogan Jedem das Sein, their previous lives were rendered irrelevant. Names, professions, families, beliefs, everything that once defined a person was stripped away and replaced with a number. This transformation was not symbolic. It was operational. The camp functioned on the principle that once a human being was reduced to an administrative unit, suffering could be managed, scaled, and justified without moral friction. Upon arrival, prisoners were processed with mechanical efficiency. Hair was shaved. Personal belongings were confiscated. Clothing was exchanged for thin, striped uniforms that erased social difference while reinforcing absolute sameness. Each inmate was assigned a number that became their primary identifier. Guards rarely used names. Capos reported numbers. Records tracked numbers. Death lists documented numbers. When a prisoner died, the system did not record a life lost. It recorded a unit removed from circulation. The individual vanished into paperwork. This bureaucratic dehumanization was one of the camp's most powerful tools. By eliminating names, the SS eliminated stories. Prisoners found it increasingly difficult to remember who they had been before the camp. Days blurred together. Hunger and exhaustion narrowed memory. Some forgot birthdays, addresses, even the faces of loved ones. Others clung desperately to fragments of their former selves, whispering names at night or repeating personal details like prayers, afraid that forgetting would mean total defeat. The uniform itself reinforced this erasure. Striped clothing reduced prisoners to a visual category, easily identifiable, interchangeable, and disposable. Colored triangles sewn onto jackets further classified inmates by Nazi ideology. Political prisoners, Jews, Roma, so-called criminals, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses. These symbols dictated treatment, work assignments, and survival chances. Identity was no longer personal. It was imposed, simplified, and weaponized. A triangle could mean harsher labor, fewer rations, or immediate suspicion. The body became a coded document, readable by guards at a glance. Language played a crucial role in sustaining this system. The SS relied heavily on euphemism and abstraction. Killings became special treatment. Starvation became reduced rations. Medical murder became research. Bureaucratic language created emotional distance, allowing perpetrators to view their actions as administrative tasks rather than moral choices. Even prisoners were forced to adopt this language to survive, learning to speak in terms the system recognized. Over time, words lost their original meaning, reshaped to fit a world where cruelty was normalized and death was routine. Time itself was redefined inside the camp. Prisoners were rarely told how long they would be imprisoned. There were no release dates, no clear sentences, no predictable milestones. This uncertainty destroyed the psychological framework people used to endure hardship. Without an endpoint, suffering felt infinite. Hope became dangerous. Some prisoners survived by refusing to imagine the future at all, focusing only on immediate survival. Others broke under the weight of endlessness, their will eroded by the absence of meaning. Children imprisoned at Buchenwald experienced this erasure with particular cruelty. Many arrived too young to fully understand what was happening. Their identities, still forming, were shaped by deprivation, violence, and fear. Education was forbidden, yet older prisoners sometimes organized secret lessons, teaching children to read or recite poetry in whispers. These acts were more than kindness. They were resistance. Teaching a child their name, their language, or their history was an act of defiance against a system designed to produce emptiness. Religion, culture, and memory were targeted as well. Religious practices were banned or punished. Cultural expression was suppressed. Songs, prayers, and rituals survived only in secret. Yet even in this environment, prisoners found ways to preserve fragments of their humanity. A shared story, a remembered melody, a quiet acknowledgement of another's suffering. These moments did not dismantle the system, but they undermined its ultimate goal: total psychological annihilation. The SS understood that identity could be a source of resistance. A person who remembers who they are is harder to fully control. This is why the camp attacked not only bodies but minds. Isolation, humiliation, and forced conformity worked together to dissolve individuality. Over time, many prisoners began to refer to themselves as numbers even in private thought, an internalization of the camp's logic that demonstrated how deeply the system penetrated the psyche. Yet identity never disappeared completely. It survived in fragile forms, etched into memory, carried in whispered names, protected through solidarity. Prisoners formed small networks based on shared language, origin, or belief. These bonds provided emotional anchoring in a world designed to unmoor every sense of self. Even acknowledging another prisoner as a person, using their name, listening to their story became an act of resistance. This segment of Buchenwald's history reveals that the camp was not only a place of physical suffering, but a machine designed to dismantle the very concept of individuality. By reducing people to numbers, symbols, and administrative categories, the Nazi system made mass cruelty possible on an industrial scale. And yet, within that machinery, traces of humanity endured. Not loudly, not heroically, but persistently, quiet proof that even in a system built to erase identity, the human need to be seen, remembered, and recognized could never be fully destroyed. Chapter 3, Segment 1. Forced Labor. Turning human life into a resource. By the time Buchenwald entered its mature phase as a concentration camp, forced labor had become its central purpose. The camp was no longer only a site of punishment or detention. It had evolved into a machine designed to extract maximum economic value from human suffering. Every prisoner was viewed not as a person, but as a unit of labor power, something to be consumed, exhausted, and ultimately discarded. In this system, survival was tied directly to usefulness, and usefulness was defined entirely by the needs of the SS and the Nazi war economy. From early morning until nightfall, prisoners were driven into relentless work details under constant threat of violence. Roll calls stretched for hours in all weather, followed by forced marches to labor sites. Men and women already weakened by starvation were expected to perform heavy physical labor with no tools, no protection, and no regard for injury. Collapse was interpreted as defiance. Slowing down invited beatings. Falling behind often meant death. Work was not simply labor, it was punishment carried out through exhaustion. Buchenwald's location made it ideal for exploitation. Situated near industrial centers and transportation routes, the camp became a hub for SS-run enterprises and private contractors. Quarries, brickworks, armaments factories, and construction sites all drew from the camp's prisoner population. As the war expanded, so did the demand for labor. Subcamps were established across Germany, spreading Buchenwald's system of exploitation far beyond its main perimeter. Prisoners were shipped out like cargo to factories producing weapons, aircraft parts, ammunition, and military equipment critical to the Nazi war effort. The SS created and controlled its own economic empire, with Buchenwald as one of its key labor reservoirs. Companies paid the SS a daily rate for each prisoner assigned to them. The prisoner received nothing, not wages, not adequate food, not medical care. Injury reduced productivity, and reduced productivity meant punishment or replacement. The system was deliberately structured to treat human beings as expendable inputs. When one body failed, another was already waiting. Conditions in labor detachments were often worse than in the main camp. Prisoners worked inside dangerous industrial environments without safety measures. Explosions, toxic exposure, crushed limbs, and fatal accidents were common. Guards showed no concern for prevention or rescue. An injured prisoner was frequently beaten for disrupting work rather than treated. Many were sent back to the camp infirmary only to die from untreated wounds, infection, or exhaustion. Starvation was built into the labor system. Rations were calculated to keep prisoners alive just long enough to work, but never strong enough to resist. Daily meals consisted of thin soup, small portions of bread, and occasional substitutes. Calories burned far exceeded calories consumed. Weight loss was rapid and severe. Muscles wasted away. Bones protruded. Yet work demands increased rather than decreased. Hunger itself became a weapon, driving prisoners to work harder in the hope of survival while simultaneously ensuring their eventual collapse. The camp administration tracked labor output obsessively. Prisoners were evaluated based on productivity, obedience, and endurance. Those deemed unfit for work were marked for removal. This did not mean rest or recovery. It meant reassignment to the most brutal tasks, transfer to extermination sites, or death through neglect. In this way, forced labor acted as a selection mechanism, silently deciding who would live a little longer and who would be eliminated. The cruelty of the system was amplified by the use of prisoner functionaries, capos, who were given authority over work details. Many capos enforced discipline with extreme brutality, driven by fear of losing their privileged position. Violence became embedded at every level of labor organization, creating an environment where prisoners were forced to police and punish one another under SS oversight. This structure fractured solidarity and deepened psychological trauma, ensuring control through division. As the war intensified, forced labor at Buchenwald grew even more lethal. Deadlines shortened, quotas increased, rest disappeared. Prisoners were worked until they collapsed, then beaten for collapsing. Deaths from work accidents and exhaustion surged. Crematoria could not keep pace. Bodies accumulated in barracks, workshops, and roll call squares. Labor had become a slow execution method, less visible than gas chambers but no less intentional. Yet even within this system, prisoners understood the grim calculus at work. Some tried to secure less deadly assignments through connections or skills. A trained mechanic, electrician, or clerk had slightly better chances than someone sent to heavy construction. Knowledge became survival currency. Others sabotaged production in small ways, damaging tools, slowing output, making defective parts, acts of resistance that carried immense risk. Discovery meant torture or execution, but the desire to undermine the system persisted. Forced labor at Buchenwald exposes a crucial truth about the Nazi camp system. Mass suffering was not a byproduct of war. It was integrated into economic planning. Human beings were deliberately consumed in service of ideology and profit. The camp did not merely confine prisoners. It extracted their strength, their health, and finally their lives, piece by piece. This was exploitation elevated to policy, cruelty transformed into routine, and murder disguised as work. By turning labor into a weapon, Buchenwald demonstrated how modern bureaucracy and industry could be fused with terror. The camp showed that genocide did not always require immediate killing. Sometimes it simply required forcing people to work until nothing was left. Chapter 3, Segment 2. Punishment as Policy. Discipline, Terror, and the Engineering of Fear. At Buchenwald, punishment was not a reaction to disorder. It was the organizing principle of the camp itself. Terror was carefully structured, deliberately visible, and relentlessly enforced to ensure obedience, break resistance, and normalize suffering. Every aspect of daily life was designed to remind prisoners that they existed at the mercy of absolute power, and that pain, humiliation, and death could be inflicted at any moment, for any reason, or for no reason at all. Punishment was not meant to correct behavior. It was meant to destroy dignity. From the moment prisoners entered Buchenwald, discipline began its work. Beatings were routine and arbitrary. Guards struck prisoners for looking in the wrong direction, for failing to remove caps quickly enough, for collapsing during roll call, or simply to demonstrate authority. Violence did not require justification. The unpredictability was intentional. When punishment could fall at random, fear became constant. No rule could guarantee safety, because the rules themselves were instruments of cruelty rather than protection. Public punishment played a central role in enforcing control. Prisoners were often forced to witness beatings, hangings, and executions carried out in roll call squares or near work sites. These spectacles were carefully staged. Victims were accused of sabotage, theft, escape attempts, or insubordination, and then tortured or killed in full view of thousands. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would not only be crushed, it would be displayed as a warning to others. Silence among the watching prisoners was mandatory. Any reaction, grief, anger, or even looking away, could bring punishment upon the observer. One of the most infamous instruments of terror at Buchenwald was the punishment bunker, a place where suffering was concentrated and intensified. Prisoners sent there were subjected to extreme isolation, starvation, and torture. Cells were small, dark, and airless. Prisoners were beaten daily, denied medical care, and sometimes left to die slowly. Interrogations were conducted with fists, clubs, and whips. Confessions were extracted not to uncover truth, but to justify further punishment. Survival in the bunker was rare, and release often meant permanent physical or psychological damage. Hanging was another favored method of execution, chosen for its visibility and cruelty. Victims were suspended by their arms behind their backs, a position that dislocated shoulders and caused excruciating pain before death. These executions were sometimes prolonged intentionally. Prisoners were forced to stand for hours watching fellow inmates struggle, suffocate, and die. The act of witnessing became part of the punishment system, spreading terror beyond the immediate victim and into the collective psyche of the camp. Punishment was also embedded in labor assignments. Prisoners accused of infractions were sent to the most lethal work details: stone quarries, construction under brutal conditions, or tasks involving toxic materials. These assignments were effectively death sentences disguised as discipline. The boundary between punishment and labor dissolved completely. Work itself became a form of torture, administered selectively to punish or eliminate. Humiliation was as important as physical pain. Prisoners were stripped naked during inspections, forced to stand for hours in freezing weather, or made to perform degrading acts. Heads were shaved. Names were replaced with numbers. Personal identity was erased systematically. Guards and capos used insults, mockery, and deliberate degradation to reinforce the idea that prisoners were subhuman. This psychological violence compounded physical suffering, breaking many long before their bodies failed. The camp's internal hierarchy deepened the cruelty. Capos, prisoners appointed by the SS to oversee others, were granted power in exchange for enforcing discipline. Many capos used extreme violence to maintain their position, knowing that any sign of weakness could result in their own punishment or death. This system forced prisoners into roles where survival depended on participating in the oppression of others. It created an atmosphere of mistrust, where solidarity was dangerous and compassion could be fatal. Children and elderly prisoners were not spared. Punishment did not discriminate by age or vulnerability. Young prisoners were beaten for failing to meet labor expectations impossible even for healthy adults. Older prisoners were punished for slowing work details they could not physically endure. The system acknowledged no limits, no mercy, and no exceptions. Cruelty was applied uniformly, reinforcing the idea that suffering was the camp's purpose, not an accident. Medical neglect functioned as another form of punishment. Injured or sick prisoners were often denied treatment deliberately. The camp infirmary was overcrowded, undersupplied, and frequently used as a holding area for those deemed unfit for work. Selection for treatment could mean transfer to death through neglect, lethal injection, or execution. Illness itself became grounds for punishment, reinforcing the message that weakness was a crime. Even death was controlled and weaponized. Corpses were displayed or left unattended to instill fear. Prisoners were forced to transport bodies of friends and relatives to crematoria. This constant exposure to death was not incidental. It was designed to numb, traumatize, and dominate. The camp became a place where life and death blurred, where survival depended not on justice or morality, but on arbitrary power. Through punishment, Buchenwald perfected a system of domination that required surprisingly few guards to control tens of thousands of prisoners. Fear did the work. Terror enforced obedience more efficiently than walls or weapons alone. By making violence routine and visible, the SS transformed the camp into a self-regulating machine of suffering. Punishment at Buchenwald reveals how terror can be bureaucratized, how cruelty becomes routine when embedded in systems, procedures, and hierarchies. It shows that oppression does not rely solely on hatred or rage. Often, it relies on organization, repetition, and the normalization of abuse. In this environment, fear was not just a response to violence, it was the foundation of control itself. Chapter 3, Segment 3: The Camp as a Machine. How Buchenwald turned human beings into controlled units. By the time Buchenwald reached full operation, it no longer functioned merely as a prison or detention site. It had become a fully engineered system, a machine designed to process human beings into categories of labor, punishment, and disposal. Every movement, every hour, every breath of a prisoner's life was regulated by an administrative logic that stripped away individuality and reduced people to measurable outputs. The camp did not rely on constant chaos. Instead, it relied on order, an order built on cruelty, precision, and repetition. This was how terror became sustainable. The daily routine at Buchenwald followed a rigid schedule that began before dawn. Prisoners were dragged from overcrowded barracks for roll call, regardless of weather, illness, or exhaustion. Thousands stood motionless for hours while guards counted, recounted, and corrected numbers. If a prisoner had died overnight, the corpse was carried out and forced to stand with the living so the numbers would match. Roll call was not about accuracy alone. It was about domination, about forcing bodies already pushed beyond human limits to endure one more act of obedience before the day even began. After roll call came labor. Assignments were determined not by skill, health, or survival potential, but by the needs of the SS and the camp's expanding role in the Nazi war economy. Prisoners were dispatched to construction sites, quarries, armament factories, workshops, and later to satellite camps tied directly to weapons production. The workday stretched endlessly, often 12 to 14 hours long, with minimal food and no rest. Collapse was common. Falling behind was punished. Survival required constant motion, even when the body was failing. The camp's bureaucracy ensured that this suffering was documented, categorized, and optimized. Clerks recorded prisoner numbers, work output, disciplinary actions, illnesses, and deaths. Forms replaced faces. Files replaced names. A prisoner who died was not mourned. He was processed. His number was crossed out. His clothing was redistributed. His body was removed. The system absorbed loss without disruption. Death was not a failure of the system, it was part of its function. Within this machine, classification was everything. Prisoners were marked with colored triangles that defined their identity and fate. Political prisoners, Jews, criminals, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, socialists. These labels determined work assignments, rations, punishment severity, and survival chances. The SS used these divisions to prevent unity. Prisoners were encouraged to see each other not as allies, but as rivals for survival. The camp thrived on fragmentation. The barracks themselves reinforced control. Built to house a few hundred, they often contained several times that number. Wooden bunks stacked high left little room to move. Sanitation was inadequate. Disease spread rapidly. Sleep was brief and shallow. Even rest became another form of deprivation. Privacy vanished entirely. The constant presence of others, watching, coughing, dying, meant there was no escape, even in the mind. Food rations were calculated not to sustain life, but to prolong suffering. Piece of bread, thin soup, occasional scraps. Hunger was constant, grinding, and humiliating. Prisoners spoke not of days or weeks, but of meals, when the next might come, and whether it would be enough to stand another roll call. Hunger weakened bodies, slowed labor, increased illness, and made punishment more effective. It was a weapon wielded quietly, efficiently, and without spectacle. Medical care existed only in name. The camp infirmary was a place of fear, not healing. Doctors operated under SS authority, and their role was often to determine who could still work and who could be discarded. Some prisoners were subjected to medical experiments. Others were killed through neglect or lethal injections. Illness became another mechanism of selection, another filter in the machine. Even time itself was controlled. Prisoners lost track of dates, seasons, and years. Days blurred together in repetition. The future narrowed to the next hour, the next command, the next step. This temporal disorientation was deliberate. When people cannot imagine tomorrow, resistance becomes harder. Hope fades. Survival becomes instinctual, not aspirational. Yet despite this total control, the machine was not perfect. Small acts of defiance persisted. Stolen moments of rest, whispered conversations, shared crumbs of bread, secret notes, and underground networks that passed information and offered mutual aid. These acts did not stop the machine, but they disrupted it, if only briefly. They reminded prisoners that they were still human, even as the system worked relentlessly to prove otherwise. Buchenwald demonstrates how mass oppression does not require constant frenzy or visible madness. It requires structure, schedules, paperwork, hierarchies, routine. The camp shows how modern systems, designed for efficiency and order, can be repurposed to produce suffering on an industrial scale. The guards did not need to invent cruelty each day. The system delivered it automatically. By turning human beings into units of labor, punishment, and disposal, Buchenwald revealed one of the most terrifying truths of the Holocaust. Genocide was not only carried out by hatred, but by administration. It was not only fueled by ideology, but by organization. The camp did not collapse under the weight of its cruelty. It functioned precisely because cruelty was built into every process. This was the world of Buchenwald in full operation, a place where terror was routine, suffering was normalized, and humanity was systematically dismantled. Not in moments of chaos, but in the quiet, relentless rhythm of a machine designed to break people until nothing remained. Chapter 4, Segment 1. Forced Labor and the Nazi War Economy. How Buchenwald Turned Suffering into Profit. By the late 1930s and into the heart of the Second World War, Buchenwald evolved from a site of political terror into a critical component of the Nazi war economy. The camp's purpose expanded beyond punishment and control. It became a reservoir of disposable labor, a place where human exhaustion was converted into industrial output. In this transformation, suffering was no longer just ideological, it became economically useful. The SS did not merely oversee Buchenwald. It managed it like an enterprise, one built on the systematic exploitation of captive bodies. From the beginning, prisoners were forced to build the camp itself. They cleared forests on Ettersberg Hill, dragged stones, erected barracks, roads, fences, and watchtowers, all under constant beatings and threats. This initial labor phase established a precedent. Prisoners would be worked until collapse, replaced without hesitation, and blamed for their own deaths. The camp quite literally rose from the labor of those it was designed to destroy. Every structure at Buchenwald carried the imprint of forced labor and violence. As the war intensified, Germany's demand for labor skyrocketed. Millions of German men were drafted into the army, leaving factories understaffed. The Nazi solution was simple: expand forced labor. Concentration camps like Buchenwald became labor reservoirs feeding the Reich's industries. Prisoners were no longer viewed only as enemies, they were resources. The SS negotiated contracts with private companies and state enterprises, renting prisoners out for construction, quarrying, and later for arms production. Human lives were priced per day. Within Buchenwald, workshops multiplied. Prisoners labored in carpentry shops, metalworks, electrical units, and repair facilities. Later, armaments production took priority. Subcamps and satellite facilities were established across central Germany, directly linked to Buchenwald's administration. Prisoners were transported daily or relocated permanently to factories producing weapons, ammunition, aircraft components, and military equipment. These sites were often underground or hidden to protect them from Allied bombing. Survival rates plummeted. Work conditions were brutal beyond description. Shifts lasted 12 to 14 hours or more. Guards enforced speed through violence. Any slowdown, whether caused by illness, injury, or hunger, was treated as sabotage. Prisoners were beaten, denied food, or executed. Accidents were frequent and fatal. Safety equipment was non-existent. Machinery tore bodies apart. Chemical exposure poisoned lungs and skin. Broken bones went untreated. Those who could no longer work were sent back to the main camp to die, or killed outright. Food rations were deliberately insufficient to sustain labor. Prisoners were expected to perform heavy industrial work while consuming barely enough calories to survive. This imbalance was not accidental. Hunger weakened resistance, shortened lifespans, and ensured a constant turnover of bodies. The SS calculated labor value not in years, but in weeks or months. Once a prisoner's productivity declined, replacement was simple. Another transport would arrive. The SS profited enormously. Camp officials enriched themselves through corruption, theft, and kickbacks from industrial contracts. Private companies benefited from cheap, unprotected labor without accountability. The German war economy, stretched thin by years of conflict, was propped up by a system that consumed human beings as fuel. Buchenwald became a cog in a vast economic machine that linked ideology, war, and genocide. Yet even within this system, resistance found dangerous forms. Prisoners sabotaged machinery, slowed production, and falsified output reports whenever possible. Skilled workers deliberately damaged components destined for the front. These acts carried enormous risk. Discovery meant torture or death. But sabotage allowed prisoners to reclaim a fragment of agency, turning forced labor into quiet defiance. It was resistance measured not in victory, but in moral survival. The use of forced labor also reshaped the internal hierarchy of the camp. Skilled workers, engineers, mechanics, electricians, sometimes received marginally better treatment because they were considered valuable. This created divisions among prisoners, which the SS exploited deliberately. Favoritism bred resentment. Survival often depended not on strength, but on assignment. A job indoors might mean life. Quarry work often meant death within weeks. As Allied bombing intensified, labor demands became even more ruthless. Production targets rose while conditions deteriorated. Bomb damage, supply shortages, and transport disruptions increased chaos. Guards responded with harsher discipline. Prisoners were forced to work through air raids. Shelters were reserved for SS personnel. The value of output outweighed the value of life. Buchenwald's role in the war economy exposes a crucial truth about the Holocaust. Mass murder and exploitation were not separate systems. They were intertwined. Camps like Buchenwald did not exist on the margins of Nazi society. They were embedded within it, connected to factories, ministries, and military planning. The suffering behind barbed wire fueled the war beyond it. This was the logic of Buchenwald's forced labor system. People reduced to tools, tools worked until broken, and broken tools discarded without pause. The camp proved that genocide could be profitable, that cruelty could be efficient, and that modern industry could function alongside mass death without contradiction. In this system, survival was accidental and death was built into the schedule. Chapter by chapter, Buchenwald reveals how terror, labor, and economy merged into a single structure, one where human suffering was not a byproduct, but the foundation. Chapter 4, Segment 2. Medical Abuse and Scientific Torture. How Buchenwald turned prisoners into experiments. At Buchenwald, suffering was not only enforced through labor and starvation, it was studied, measured, and institutionalized under the language of medicine. Behind clinic doors and laboratory benches, the SS transformed the camp into a site of medical abuse where prisoners were reduced to experimental material. These experiments were not accidental excesses or isolated crimes. They were planned, documented, and justified as contributions to science, public health, and military necessity. In reality, they were acts of systematic torture carried out under white coats. The medical apparatus at Buchenwald was extensive. The camp infirmary, known as the Revier, was not a place of healing. It functioned as a sorting station between temporary survival and death. Prisoner doctors, often highly trained physicians themselves, were forced to work under SS supervision, compelled to assist in experiments or falsify records. Refusal meant execution. Compliance meant survival shadowed by guilt. The SS maintained full control, using medicine as another tool of domination. One of the most notorious categories of experiments conducted at Buchenwald involved infectious diseases. Typhus, already rampant due to overcrowding and lice infestation, became the focus of deliberate infection trials. Prisoners were injected with pathogens to test vaccines and treatments intended for German soldiers. Many subjects were chosen because they were already weakened, ensuring faster deterioration. High fevers, delirium, organ failure, and death followed. Survivors were often left permanently damaged. Other experiments targeted tuberculosis, yellow fever, diphtheria, and hepatitis. Prisoners were infected, monitored, and dissected, sometimes literally. Autopsies were performed on those who died, while survivors were reused for further trials. Pain relief was rare. Consent was non-existent. The goal was data, not life. In this setting, medicine abandoned its ethical foundation entirely. Chemical testing formed another layer of abuse. Prisoners were exposed to toxic substances, including industrial poisons and chemical warfare agents. Burns, respiratory collapse, blindness, and internal damage were common outcomes. These tests were justified as research into battlefield exposure or industrial safety. In truth, they were exercises in controlled suffering, carried out on bodies deemed expendable. Perhaps the most grotesque experiments involved physical mutilation. Bone grafting trials, muscle transplants, and nerve damage experiments were performed without anesthesia or proper surgical care. Prisoners were deliberately wounded, their injuries left untreated or deliberately infected to study healing, or the lack of it. Many died slowly from sepsis. Those who survived were crippled, often unable to work and thus sent to their deaths. Buchenwald was also a site of pseudo-eugenic research. SS doctors obsessed with racial ideology measured skulls, catalogued physical traits, and dissected bodies to support Nazi theories of biological hierarchy. Jewish prisoners, Roma, and others were targeted for comparative studies meant to prove inferiority. These studies had no scientific validity. Their conclusions were predetermined, designed to reinforce ideology rather than discover truth. Children were not spared. Young prisoners were used in nutritional experiments, starved under controlled conditions to observe the effects of deprivation. Others were subjected to medical neglect to see how long they could survive without treatment. The presence of children in these experiments exposes the total moral collapse of the system, where even the most basic instinct to protect life was erased. The SS justified all of this through bureaucratic language. Prisoners were subjects. Deaths were complications. Torture was procedure. Reports were filed, charts maintained, and results forwarded to institutes and universities. Buchenwald's medical crimes were not hidden from the Nazi state, they were integrated into it. Academic institutions benefited. Careers advanced. Responsibility diffused across a network that pretended neutrality. For prisoners, the infirmary inspired terror. Being selected for treatment often meant death. Many tried to avoid medical attention even when gravely ill, knowing that weakness could make them targets for experiments or selections. Others volunteered desperately, hoping for a momentary reprieve from labor, unaware of what awaited them. Rumors spread quickly. Fear became contagious. Yet even here, resistance existed. Prisoner doctors sometimes falsified records, swapped names, or hid the sick to protect them from experimentation. They diluted doses, sabotaged procedures, and lied to SS supervisors when possible. These acts were extraordinarily dangerous. Discovery meant immediate execution. Still, some chose to risk everything to save lives, preserving fragments of medical ethics in a place designed to annihilate them. As the war turned against Germany, experimentation did not cease. It intensified. Desperation fueled brutality. Data was rushed. Subjects were used more aggressively. The collapse of the front lines did not slow the machinery inside the camp. Until the final weeks, prisoners continued to be abused in the name of research that had already crossed every moral boundary. The medical crimes of Buchenwald reveal a central truth about Nazi terror. It was not only enforced by guards with weapons, but by professionals with degrees, titles, and authority. Science did not merely coexist with genocide, it participated in it. The camp demonstrated how easily knowledge could be weaponized when stripped of ethics, and how institutions meant to heal could be transformed into instruments of destruction. Buchenwald's laboratories were not aberrations. They were warnings. They show that when ideology overrides humanity, and when obedience replaces conscience, even the most respected disciplines can become tools of mass suffering. The scars left by these experiments did not end with liberation. Survivors carried physical pain, psychological trauma, and unanswered questions for the rest of their lives, living evidence of what happens when medicine forgets its purpose. In this chapter of Buchenwald's history, cruelty wore a clinical face, and behind it stood a system that called torture progress and death discovery. Chapter 4, Segment 3. Punishment, Execution, and Psychological Terror. How Buchenwald controlled through fear. At Buchenwald, punishment was not simply a response to disobedience. It was a system carefully engineered to dominate, intimidate, and psychologically destroy. Violence was ritualized, public, and deliberately unpredictable. The goal was not only to punish the individual, but to educate the entire camp in fear. Every beating, every execution, every scream carried a message. Survival depended on absolute submission. From the moment prisoners arrived, Discipline was enforced through brutality. New arrivals were beaten during roll call, humiliated, forced to stand for hours regardless of weather, and subjected to arbitrary rules designed to ensure failure. A wrong step, a missing button, a glance held too long could result in punishment. The lack of consistency was intentional. When rules shift without warning, obedience becomes impossible, and fear becomes permanent. Public punishment was one of the SS' most effective tools. Prisoners were routinely forced to assemble in the Appellplatz, the roll call square, to witness floggings and executions. These spectacles were choreographed. Victims were accused loudly, sentenced publicly, and punished slowly. Whippings were carried out with wooden batons, rubber truncheons, or metal rods, often until the prisoner lost consciousness or died. Survivors were expected to stand and return to work immediately, blood-soaked and barely able to walk. One of the most infamous methods of punishment at Buchenwald was hanging by the arms, known among prisoners as the tree. Victims were suspended by their wrists behind their backs, dislocating shoulders and causing intense pain. Sessions could last hours. Many prisoners suffered permanent damage or died from shock. This punishment required no execution order. It could be imposed at the whim of guards or capos. Starvation itself was a form of punishment. Rations were deliberately reduced for entire barracks as collective discipline. One prisoner's alleged offense could condemn hundreds to hunger. This system turned prisoners against one another, eroding solidarity and fostering suspicion. Hunger weakened bodies, but it also weakened resistance. Executions at Buchenwald were frequent and varied. Some prisoners were shot. Others were hanged. Many were killed through lethal injection, disguised as medical treatment. Soviet prisoners of war were often murdered en masse, taken to a special execution facility disguised as a medical examination room where they were shot in the neck. The process was efficient, silent, and repeated thousands of times. The camp also employed psychological terror as a weapon. Prisoners never knew when selections would occur or who would be chosen. Randomness amplified fear. At night, guards would drag prisoners from barracks without explanation. The screams that followed were heard but never explained. Uncertainty became a constant companion, eroding mental stability. Children and teenagers imprisoned at Buchenwald were not spared. Many were forced to witness violence as a form of intimidation. Others were punished as adults, beaten or starved for minor infractions. The presence of children in these rituals of terror underscored the SS' complete disregard for human life. Innocence offered no protection. The role of capos, prisoners appointed by the SS to supervise others, was central to the punishment system. Often selected for their brutality, capos enforced discipline with extreme violence. Their power was absolute within the barracks. Some abused it savagely, beating prisoners to death. Others attempted to protect those under their control, walking a dangerous line between survival and conscience. This system blurred moral boundaries, forcing prisoners into impossible choices. Punishment extended beyond physical harm. Prisoners were subjected to humiliation, forced nudity, mockery, degradation designed to strip identity and dignity. Names were replaced with numbers. Personal possessions were destroyed. Cultural and religious practices were forbidden. The aim was total domination, control of body, mind, and spirit. As the war progressed and resources dwindled, violence intensified. SS guards, increasingly desperate and fearful, lashed out with greater cruelty. Executions increased. Beatings became more severe. The breakdown of order did not lead to mercy. It produced chaos and rage. Buchenwald became even deadlier in its final years. Yet even within this machinery of terror, resistance persisted. Prisoners warned one another of impending punishments, hid the weak, falsified lists, and delayed executions when possible. Underground networks documented crimes, preserved evidence, and prepared for the moment when the camp might fall. These acts of defiance were small, fragile, and extraordinarily dangerous, but they kept the idea of humanity alive. The punishment system at Buchenwald reveals a core truth about Nazi camps. They were not only places of confinement but laboratories of control. Violence was not spontaneous, it was policy. Fear was not a side effect, it was the objective. By forcing prisoners to witness suffering daily, the SS sought to normalize terror and extinguish hope. But terror, while powerful, was not absolute. The very need for constant punishment revealed the fragility of the system. Control had to be enforced every day because resistance, silent, hidden, persistent, never fully disappeared. Even under the threat of death, prisoners continued to help one another, remember who they were, and refuse complete surrender. Buchenwald's punishments were designed to erase humanity. That they failed, even partially, stands as a testament to the resilience of those who endured them. The camp tried to rule through fear alone, and in doing so exposed the moral emptiness at the heart of Nazi terror. Chapter 5, Segment 1. Forced Labor and the Nazi War Economy. How Buchenwald turned human beings into fuel for war. Buchenwald was not only a place of punishment and terror, it was a central component of the Nazi war economy, a camp designed to extract every possible ounce of labor from prisoners before their bodies collapsed. Unlike extermination camps built primarily for immediate mass murder, Buchenwald operated as a machine of slow destruction, where work itself became a weapon. Prisoners were not expected to survive. They were expected to work until they could no longer stand, and then be replaced. This system of forced labor transformed suffering into profit and tied the camp directly to Germany's ability to wage total war. From its earliest years, forced labor was embedded into Buchenwald's purpose. Prisoners were compelled to build the camp itself, clearing forests, hauling stone, erecting barracks, roads, fences, and guard towers under constant abuse. The labor was intentionally exhausting and poorly organized. Efficiency was secondary to domination. The SS understood that breaking the body was a way to break the mind, and labor was the most effective means of doing both at once. As Germany rearmed and later entered full-scale war, Buchenwald's role expanded dramatically. The camp became a reservoir of enslaved workers for SS-owned enterprises and private German companies. Factories, workshops, and satellite camps sprang up around Buchenwald, linking it to arms production, construction, mining, and manufacturing. Prisoners produced weapons, ammunition, uniforms, vehicle parts, and equipment essential to the German military. Each product carried the invisible cost of human suffering. One of the most significant forced labor sites connected to Buchenwald was the Gustloff Works, where prisoners manufactured rifles and other armaments. Men weakened by hunger and disease were forced to operate heavy machinery for long hours, often standing for 12 to 14 hours a day. Accidents were common. Injuries were rarely treated. A prisoner who could no longer work was deemed useless, and uselessness was a death sentence. The SS deliberately calibrated food rations to labor output. Prisoners performing the hardest work received marginally more food, but never enough to recover strength. This calculated starvation ensured that bodies slowly deteriorated even as they were exploited. Weight loss was rapid. Muscles wasted away. Immune systems collapsed. Labor did not sustain life. It consumed it. Work assignments were stratified, and survival often depended on placement. Outdoor labor in quarries, forests, or construction sites was especially lethal, exposing prisoners to weather, beatings, and exhaustion. Indoor factory jobs offered slightly better chances of survival, but these positions were limited and often controlled by capos. Favoritism, bribery, and corruption flourished, forcing prisoners into moral compromises simply to avoid the most deadly tasks. Women and children were not exempt from forced labor. Although Buchenwald was initially a men's camp, female prisoners and minors were later incorporated into its labor system, particularly through subcamps. Children were used as messengers, runners, or light laborers, jobs that still exposed them to violence, malnutrition, and death. Childhood was erased by work schedules and fear. The language of the Nazi bureaucracy concealed the reality of this exploitation. Documents referred to labor deployment, economic utilization, and productivity, masking the truth that prisoners were being worked to death. This administrative distance allowed officials, engineers, and managers to participate without confronting the human consequences of their decisions. Paperwork replaced morality. Private companies benefited enormously from this system. Contracts were signed. Profits were calculated. The SS charged companies a daily rate per prisoner, turning human beings into rented commodities. The prisoners received nothing. No wages, no protection, no choice. Their bodies absorbed the cost of production, while the state and corporations reaped the rewards. As the war intensified and German manpower dwindled, reliance on camp labor increased. Buchenwald's population swelled as prisoners were transferred from other camps and occupied territories. Overcrowding worsened. Sanitation collapsed. Disease spread rapidly. Yet work demands only increased. The contradiction was brutal. The more prisoners died, the harder the survivors were driven. Resistance within the labor system took subtle forms. Prisoners sabotaged machinery, slowed production, falsified output numbers, and passed defective parts when possible. These acts were extraordinarily dangerous. Discovery meant torture or execution. But sabotage represented one of the few ways prisoners could fight back against the system using the tools forced upon them. Medical neglect was inseparable from forced labor. Prisoners injured on the job were often denied treatment or sent to so-called infirmaries where death rates were high. Many were selected for medical experiments instead of care. The logic was ruthless. A broken worker was no longer an asset, but could still be used for experimentation or extermination. By late 1944, as Allied bombing intensified and German industry was pushed underground, forced labor expanded into new, even more brutal forms. Prisoners were sent to subterranean factories, digging tunnels and caverns under lethal conditions. Air was scarce. Dust choked lungs. Cave-ins were frequent. Entire work details disappeared without record. Forced labor at Buchenwald reveals a critical truth about the Holocaust. Genocide and economics were not separate processes. They were intertwined. The Nazi regime did not simply kill its victims. It extracted value from them first. Suffering was monetized. Death was delayed only as long as labor remained possible. This system depended on countless participants: SS guards, camp administrators, engineers, factory managers, clerks, and civilian officials. Many never touched a prisoner, yet their decisions sustained the machinery of exploitation. Responsibility was diffused, making the crime feel abstract until the bodies piled up. Buchenwald's forced labor regime stands as a warning about how modern systems can be weaponized. Efficiency, organization, and productivity, values often seen as neutral or positive, were stripped of ethics and turned into instruments of destruction. When human beings are reduced to resources, cruelty becomes routine. Yet even here, within a system designed to extract life itself, acts of humanity persisted. Prisoners shared food, covered for the weak, and risked punishment to protect one another. Survival was never guaranteed, but solidarity offered meaning in a place built to erase it. Forced labor did not merely support Nazi terror, it defined it. Buchenwald proved that a camp did not need gas chambers to kill on a massive scale. Work, when imposed without mercy, could be just as deadly. Chapter 5, Segment 2. Starvation, Disease, and Medical Abuse. How the body was systematically destroyed at Buchenwald. If forced labor was the engine of destruction at Buchenwald, starvation and disease were the silent partners that ensured no prisoner could endure it for long. The camp was designed so that even those who survived beatings and exhausting work would slowly collapse from within. Hunger, illness, and medical abuse were not accidental byproducts of chaos. They were integral tools of control, punishment, and extermination, carefully tolerated and often deliberately intensified by the SS. From the moment prisoners arrived at Buchenwald, hunger became a constant presence. Food rations were deliberately insufficient, calculated not to sustain life but to prolong suffering. A typical daily ration consisted of thin, watery soup made from turnips or cabbage, a small piece of bread often mixed with sawdust or fillers, and occasionally a trace of margarine or sausage. The calories provided were far below what was required even for rest, let alone for the brutal labor prisoners were forced to perform. Hunger was not just physical, it was psychological, dominating thoughts, dreams, and behavior. Starvation reshaped the camp's social order. Food became currency. A crust of bread could buy protection, information, or survival itself. Prisoners scavenged potato peels from garbage, licked soup bowls clean, chewed grass, and risked beatings to steal scraps. As bodies weakened, moral boundaries were pushed to their limits. The SS understood this and exploited it, knowing that hunger fractured solidarity and made prisoners easier to control. As malnutrition spread, disease followed inevitably. Buchenwald was catastrophically overcrowded, especially as the war progressed and transports arrived from evacuated camps in the east. Barracks built for a few hundred men were packed with thousands. Prisoners slept stacked on wooden bunks or directly on the floor, pressed together without space to move. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Latrines overflowed. Clean water was scarce. Lice and fleas spread unchecked. Typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, pneumonia, and other infectious diseases tore through the camp population. A single infected prisoner could doom an entire barrack. Fever, delirium, and diarrhea were common, yet prisoners were still forced to report for roll call and labor. Those who collapsed were beaten for weakness. Disease was treated not as a medical condition, but as a sign of failure. The camp infirmary, known as the Revier, offered little refuge. In theory, it existed to treat the sick. In reality, it functioned as a sorting station between temporary survival and death. Prisoners feared being sent there, knowing that admission often meant selection for medical experiments, neglect, or execution. Beds were overcrowded. Supplies were inadequate. Doctors, some prisoners themselves, were forced to work under SS supervision, making impossible choices about whom to treat and whom to abandon. Medical abuse was one of the most chilling aspects of Buchenwald's operation. The camp became a site for Nazi medical experimentation, carried out in the name of science and military research. Prisoners were deliberately infected with diseases such as typhus to test vaccines. Others were subjected to experiments involving poisons, burns, wounds, and extreme temperature exposure. Consent was never given. Survival was rarely expected. One of the most notorious areas of abuse involved experiments on prisoners' bodies to test endurance, recovery, and pain tolerance. Victims were treated as living laboratory material, their suffering documented with clinical detachment. Deaths were recorded as data points. The human being disappeared behind numbers and charts. Children were not spared. Juvenile prisoners, including teenagers and younger boys, suffered from starvation and disease at even faster rates. Their developing bodies could not withstand prolonged malnutrition. Many were used for experiments or died quietly in barracks, their deaths barely recorded. Childhood, like health, had no place at Buchenwald. The SS used disease strategically. Quarantines were imposed not to protect prisoners, but to isolate and abandon the sick. Entire barracks were sealed off, left without adequate food or care, turning them into slow death chambers. Guards avoided contact, allowing epidemics to burn themselves out through mass death. Corpses became a common sight. Bodies lay in barracks, courtyards, and along paths, sometimes for days, because there were too many dead and too few able-bodied prisoners to remove them. The crematorium could not keep pace. Death lost its shock value. It became routine, normalized, expected. Starvation and disease also functioned as selection mechanisms. Prisoners who grew too weak to work were labeled Muselmänner, a term used to describe those reduced to skeletal figures, barely alive. Once identified, they were often removed from labor details and sent to die, either through neglect, lethal injections, or transfer to extermination camps. Medical personnel within the SS played a central role in this process. Camp doctors conducted selections, deciding who was fit to work and who was not. These decisions were often made in seconds, based on appearance alone. A glance at sunken cheeks or trembling hands could seal a prisoner's fate. Yet within this landscape of medical cruelty, there were also moments of resistance and compassion. Prisoner doctors and nurses risked punishment to hide the sick, falsify records, or share scarce medicine. Secret networks attempted to protect children and the weakest prisoners by assigning them lighter tasks or concealing their condition. These acts did not overturn the system, but they preserved fragments of humanity within it. The combination of starvation, disease, and medical abuse reveals how Buchenwald functioned as a camp of prolonged destruction. Prisoners were not killed quickly. They were worn down, dismantled piece by piece. First strength, then health, then dignity, and finally life itself. The suffering was drawn out, making death almost feel like release. This system required no extraordinary cruelty in each individual act. It relied on routine neglect, bureaucratic decisions, and the calculated absence of care. The horror of Buchenwald was not only in what was done, but in what was deliberately withheld. Food, medicine, rest, and mercy. By the time prisoners died, their deaths often appeared inevitable, almost natural. That illusion was part of the crime. Starvation and disease were not natural forces at Buchenwald. They were engineered conditions, sustained by policy and indifference. In this way, Buchenwald demonstrates one of the most disturbing truths of the Nazi camp system. Mass death did not require constant killing. It required only a system designed to let people die slowly under control. Chapter 5, Segment 3. Public executions, psychological terror, and the architecture of fear at Buchenwald. If starvation and disease destroyed the body at Buchenwald, terror was used to break the mind. Violence in the camp was not random or uncontrolled. It was carefully staged, ritualized, and made visible. The SS understood that fear could discipline thousands more effectively than constant force. Public executions, arbitrary punishment, and psychological humiliation became essential tools in maintaining absolute control over prisoners who already lived on the edge of physical collapse. From its earliest days, Buchenwald was designed as a theater of terror. The camp's layout itself served this purpose. Open roll call squares, gallows placed in visible areas, punishment blocks positioned near main paths. Everything was arranged so that suffering could be seen. Death was not hidden. It was displayed. Roll calls were one of the most effective instruments of psychological torture. Prisoners were forced to stand for hours, sometimes in freezing cold, sometimes under blazing sun, while SS guards conducted counts, inspections, and punishments. Sick prisoners were dragged out of barracks and made to stand until they collapsed. The dead were often propped upright or carried to roll call so numbers would match. The message was clear: even death did not excuse disobedience. Public executions were staged as warnings. Hangings were carried out in front of assembled prisoners, often after forced marches to the execution site. Victims were accused of sabotage, escape attempts, theft, or resistance, sometimes falsely, sometimes without explanation at all. The condemned were forced to stand before the crowd while charges were read aloud. Silence was mandatory. Any reaction, grief, anger, even turning away, could result in immediate punishment. The execution itself was slow and deliberate. Prisoners were often made to wait, increasing the tension. SS officers observed not just the victim, but the audience. Fear was contagious, and that was the point. Each execution was meant to echo far beyond the moment of death, imprinting obedience into every witness. Punishment at Buchenwald extended far beyond execution. Beatings were routine, administered for minor infractions such as standing incorrectly, speaking without permission, or failing to meet impossible labor quotas. Guards carried whips, sticks, and rifle butts. Violence was arbitrary, unpredictable, and therefore terrifying. Prisoners never knew what action or inaction might provoke it. One of the most notorious punishment methods was flogging. Prisoners were tied to whipping benches and beaten in front of others, often until unconscious or dead. The number of lashes was predetermined, but guards frequently exceeded it. Medical staff were sometimes present, not to protect the victim, but to ensure the beating could continue without immediate death. Psychological terror was reinforced through constant humiliation. Prisoners were stripped of names and assigned numbers. They were forced to wear degrading clothing, shave their heads, and submit to invasive inspections. Individual identity was systematically erased. Guards mocked prisoners, forcing them to sing, dance, or perform absurd tasks while being beaten. The punishment block, known as the bunker, was another center of fear. Prisoners sent there were subjected to isolation, darkness, starvation, and extreme abuse. Cells were cramped, airless, and cold. Time lost meaning. Screams echoed through the corridors, reminding others what awaited them if they disobeyed. Children and teenagers were not spared from terror. Younger prisoners were forced to witness executions and punishments, a deliberate tactic to crush hope early. Fear became part of growing up inside the camp. Innocence was stripped away as thoroughly as clothing. Psychological control also relied on uncertainty. Rules changed without warning. Orders contradicted one another. Prisoners were punished for following instructions that had been given moments earlier. This unpredictability destroyed any sense of stability or fairness. Survival depended not on logic, but on luck. The SS cultivated an atmosphere where prisoners were encouraged to police one another. Capos, prisoners appointed as overseers, were given power over others in exchange for privileges. Some abused this power brutally, becoming instruments of terror themselves. This fractured solidarity and blurred the line between victim and enforcer, deepening psychological damage. Fear followed prisoners even into moments of supposed rest. Nights were interrupted by surprise inspections, beatings, and selections. Sleep deprivation weakened resistance and increased vulnerability. Dreams offered no escape, as the threat of violence was constant. Executions were not always formal. Many prisoners were shot, beaten to death, or hanged without ceremony. Others were killed during forced labor or shot while attempting escape, a phrase used to justify arbitrary murder. These killings reinforced the idea that life had no value inside the camp. Yet terror was also bureaucratic. Records were kept. Punishments were logged. Deaths were categorized. The SS presented violence as discipline, cruelty as order. This administrative framing allowed perpetrators to see themselves not as murderers, but as functionaries enforcing rules. Despite this overwhelming atmosphere of fear, terror did not fully succeed in destroying resistance. Some prisoners learned to mask emotions, creating inner worlds the SS could not reach. Others formed secret bonds of trust, sharing whispered warnings and small acts of kindness. These fragile connections were dangerous, but they preserved humanity. The true horror of Buchenwald's terror system lay not only in physical pain, but in the slow erosion of the self. Fear became internalized. Prisoners began to anticipate punishment, to doubt their own worth, to expect death as inevitable. This psychological collapse was as lethal as any beating. By turning violence into spectacle and fear into routine, the SS transformed Buchenwald into a camp where obedience was enforced without constant killing, because terror did the work for them. Prisoners learned that survival required silence, invisibility, and submission. This was the architecture of fear, carefully constructed, relentlessly maintained, and devastatingly effective. It ensured that even those who survived starvation and disease lived under constant threat, never free from the shadow of violence. In Buchenwald, terror was not an accident. It was policy, and it left scars that outlasted liberation, etched not only into bodies but into memory itself. Chapter 6, Segment 1. Forced Labor and the Nazi War Economy. Turning human beings into machines. By the early years of the Second World War, Buchenwald had fully evolved into something more than a prison camp. It became a critical engine of forced labor, tightly integrated into the Nazi war economy. The camp no longer existed only to punish and terrorize. It existed to extract value from human bodies until nothing remained. Every prisoner was assessed not by innocence or guilt, but by usefulness. Strength meant temporary survival. Weakness meant selection, punishment, or death. The Nazi leadership believed war could be won not only with weapons, but with labor stolen from those they had dehumanized. Buchenwald became a testing ground for this belief. Prisoners were forced to work under conditions designed to exhaust them completely, while SS administrators carefully calculated output, efficiency, and replacement rates. Human beings were treated as consumable resources. At first, prisoners were forced to build and expand the camp itself. They cleared forests, hauled stones, poured concrete, and erected barracks, fences, watchtowers, and administrative buildings. This labor was brutally physical, performed with minimal tools, insufficient food, and constant violence. Those who collapsed were beaten. Those who could not rise were left behind. Construction was not only practical, it was symbolic. Prisoners were made to create the very structure that imprisoned them. As the war intensified, forced labor expanded far beyond the camp's perimeter. Buchenwald became the hub of a vast network of subcamps spread across central Germany. These satellite camps were attached to factories, mines, rail yards, quarries, and arms plants. Prisoners were transported daily or permanently relocated to these sites, where conditions were often even worse than at the main camp. German companies eagerly participated. Firms such as IG Farben, Gustloff-Werke, and other industrial contractors relied on camp labor to meet wartime production demands. Weapons, ammunition, aircraft parts, and military equipment were manufactured by prisoners who were starving, sick, and exhausted. The SS charged companies fees per prisoner, turning forced labor into a profitable business. Workdays were long, often 12 hours or more, regardless of weather or physical condition. Safety was irrelevant. Injuries were common and rarely treated. A broken limb or infected wound could mean death. Prisoners were expected to maintain productivity even as their bodies deteriorated. Falling output was punished as sabotage. The concept of extermination through labor was not always stated openly, but it was clearly practiced. Prisoners were worked until they collapsed, then replaced by new arrivals. Food rations were deliberately insufficient to sustain long-term health. Caloric intake was calculated to keep prisoners alive just long enough to extract labor, not to preserve life. Assignments were often deliberately cruel. Some prisoners were sent to quarries where they carried massive stones uphill for hours. Others worked in underground tunnels with toxic air and frequent cave-ins. Still others labored in factories filled with dangerous machinery without training or protection. Death was a predictable outcome. The SS used labor assignments as another tool of control. Better jobs indoors with slightly less physical strain were sometimes granted in exchange for obedience, information, or connections. This system created hierarchy and division among prisoners, weakening solidarity and increasing competition for survival. Skilled laborers were especially valuable. Engineers, mechanics, electricians, and craftsmen were identified and exploited for technical work. Their survival rates were slightly higher, but only temporarily. Even skilled prisoners were replaceable. When illness or exhaustion reduced productivity, they too were discarded. Children and teenagers were not exempt from forced labor. Younger prisoners were assigned lighter tasks at first, but over time many were pushed into the same grueling work as adults. Their bodies broke faster. Their deaths were quieter. The bureaucracy surrounding forced labor was chillingly precise. Work output was recorded. Absences were noted. Deaths were logged as losses of labor units. The language used by administrators stripped away humanity entirely. Prisoners were numbers, inputs, and expendable assets. As Allied bombing intensified, forced labor became even more essential. Prisoners were sent to repair bomb damage, clear rubble, and build underground facilities meant to protect German industry. These tasks were among the most dangerous, performed under collapsing structures and air raid conditions. Resistance within labor details was extremely risky but did occur. Prisoners sabotaged machinery, slowed production, or intentionally damaged components. Discovery meant severe punishment or execution. Yet many chose resistance anyway, believing that even small acts of defiance mattered. Forced labor reshaped daily life in Buchenwald. Exhaustion consumed every waking moment. Conversations revolved around work assignments, injuries, and survival strategies. The future shrank to the length of a single shift. Hope became measured in hours rather than years. The irony of Buchenwald's forced labor system was stark. While the Nazi state claimed order, efficiency, and progress, it built its war effort on systematic cruelty and waste. Skilled laborers died unnecessarily. Production suffered from constant replacement and chaos. Yet ideology overruled logic. Suffering itself became a goal. By transforming Buchenwald into a labor camp at the heart of the war economy, the SS ensured that prisoners were no longer merely victims of terror. They were trapped inside a machine that consumed them piece by piece. Work did not offer redemption or dignity. It offered only delay. This was the grim calculus of forced labor. Survive today by destroying your body for tomorrow, knowing that tomorrow might never come. In Buchenwald, labor was not a path to life. It was another method of death, slower, quieter, and just as deliberate. Chapter 6, Segment 2. Starvation, Disease, and Medical Abuse. The Science of Slow Death. If forced labor was the visible engine of destruction at Buchenwald, starvation and disease were its invisible accelerants. They worked quietly, relentlessly, and everywhere. By design, prisoners were never meant to recover their strength. Food, sanitation, and medical care were calibrated not to preserve life, but to weaken bodies until they could no longer endure the demands placed upon them. Death did not arrive suddenly for most. It arrived by erosion. Daily rations at Buchenwald were deliberately inadequate. A thin soup made from turnips or cabbage water, a scrap of bread often mixed with sawdust or fillers, and occasional traces of margarine formed the core of a prisoner's diet. Caloric intake rarely matched the energy burned during forced labor. Weight fell rapidly, muscles wasted, immune systems collapsed. Hunger became a constant physical pain and a consuming mental presence. Prisoners spoke of dreaming about food, bargaining over crumbs, and measuring survival in mouthfuls. Starvation altered behavior. Men who had lived ethical, principled lives before imprisonment found themselves scavenging garbage, licking bowls clean, or stealing from the dead. The SS understood this effect well. Hunger fractured solidarity and fostered desperation. It turned prisoners inward, narrowing focus to the next meal, the next scrap, the next chance to survive another day. Morality became a luxury few could afford. Disease flourished in these conditions. Overcrowded barracks packed hundreds into spaces designed for a fraction of that number. Ventilation was poor. Beds were shared. Blankets were scarce and infested with lice. Water supplies were unreliable. Latrines overflowed. Washing was infrequent and often impossible during winter months. In this environment, epidemics spread with terrifying speed. Typhus, carried by lice, became one of the most lethal killers in Buchenwald. Dysentery, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and scurvy followed. Fever swept through barracks, leaving men delirious and shaking. Weak prisoners were unable to stand during roll calls, sometimes for hours in freezing weather. Those who collapsed were beaten or removed. Illness itself became a crime. The camp infirmary, known as the Revier, offered little refuge. On paper, it existed to treat the sick. In practice, it functioned as another filter of selection. Limited beds meant that only those deemed temporarily useful were admitted. Others were sent away, often directly to death. Medicine was scarce. Hygiene was minimal. Doctors, some prisoners, some SS, worked under impossible constraints and ideological pressure. Medical abuse was systematic. SS physicians conducted experiments under the guise of research, exploiting prisoners as test subjects without consent. Injections of infectious agents, exposure to extreme temperatures, and testing of unproven treatments were carried out with little regard for suffering or survival. Results were documented clinically. Pain was irrelevant. Some experiments focused on typhus and other diseases not to cure prisoners but to benefit German soldiers. Prisoners were infected deliberately, monitored as symptoms progressed, and often left untreated. Deaths were recorded as data points. Bodies were disposed of quietly. The relationship between starvation and disease was intentional. Malnutrition weakened immune defenses, making infections more deadly. Disease reduced strength, lowering work output and increasing vulnerability to punishment. Together, they created a feedback loop that accelerated mortality while maintaining the appearance of administrative order. Selection operated constantly. Prisoners judged too weak to work were labeled Muselmänner, a term used to describe those near death. These men were often removed during inspections, transferred to other camps, or executed. The language of administration disguised the reality. They were being culled. Children suffered particularly. Young prisoners lacked the physical reserves to endure prolonged hunger and disease. Many were assigned to labor beyond their capacity. Others were used in medical experiments. Survival among children was rare, and death often came quickly. Psychological damage accompanied physical decline. Prolonged hunger impaired cognition. Fever caused hallucinations. Constant fear eroded sleep. Prisoners lost track of time, identity, and purpose. Some withdrew completely, lying still until death came. Others clung to routines, memories, or whispered conversations as anchors against collapse. Even death itself became overcrowded. Crematoria could not keep pace during epidemics. Bodies were stacked, buried hastily, or left exposed. The presence of death was constant, seen, smelled, and felt. It was impossible to escape its reminder. The SS did not view this as failure. They viewed it as efficiency. Starvation and disease required fewer bullets, less oversight, and minimal infrastructure. They transformed biology into a weapon, allowing nature to finish what policy began. Yet within this engineered suffering, moments of resistance persisted. Prisoner doctors secretly shared knowledge, diluted experimental doses, or falsified records to save lives when possible. Others smuggled food to the sick, risking severe punishment. These acts were small, fragile, and often unsuccessful, but they mattered. Starvation and disease at Buchenwald were not accidents of war. They were components of a system that understood how to kill slowly and plausibly. The camp did not need gas chambers to destroy human beings. It used time, hunger, infection, and indifference. In this environment, survival became an act of defiance. Each morning a prisoner rose despite hunger and fever. The system failed to erase them completely. But the cost was staggering. Bodies were broken. Lives were shortened. Futures were stolen. Buchenwald's science of slow death revealed a chilling truth. Genocide does not always arrive with spectacle. Sometimes it arrives with empty bowls, untreated wounds, and the quiet acceptance of suffering as policy. Chapter 6, Segment 3. Normalizing Cruelty. How suffering became routine. By the time starvation, disease, and medical abuse had taken their hold, something even more dangerous had settled over Buchenwald: normalization. Cruelty no longer announced itself with shouting or spectacle. It became routine, predictable, administrative. Suffering was no longer shocking, it was expected. And that expectation was one of the camp's most powerful weapons. At Buchenwald, violence did not rely solely on moments of extreme brutality. It relied on repetition. Roll calls that lasted for hours in freezing rain. Beatings for standing too slowly, punishments for looking in the wrong direction, days without food followed by labor that demanded everything the body no longer had. Over time, prisoners learned that pain was not exceptional. It was procedural. This normalization affected everyone inside the camp system, guards and prisoners alike. For the SS, cruelty became work. Orders were followed. Logs were kept. Quotas were met. The language of paperwork transformed human suffering into entries and numbers. A death was not a tragedy. It was a statistic. An illness was not a person. It was a reduction in labor capacity. Punishment blocks operated with mechanical efficiency. Prisoners were confined in dark cells, suspended by their arms, deprived of food and water, or subjected to prolonged isolation. These punishments were not hidden. They were visible reminders of control. The SS wanted prisoners to understand that resistance, even passive resistance, would be answered systematically. Public executions served a similar purpose. Hangings were conducted in front of assembled prisoners. Silence was enforced. No reaction was permitted. The goal was not just to kill one individual, but to imprint fear into hundreds of witnesses. Over time, even these spectacles lost their shock. Prisoners learned to stare at the ground, to dissociate, to survive the moment by emotionally withdrawing from it. This psychological adaptation was essential for survival, but it came at a cost. Normalización blurred moral boundaries. When death was constant, grief became exhausting. Mourning was dangerous. Emotional attachment increased vulnerability. Many prisoners learned to suppress empathy not because they lacked humanity, but because feeling too much could destroy them. The camp hierarchy exploited this dynamic. Kapos, prisoners appointed by the SS to supervise others, were given limited power in exchange for enforcing discipline. Some abused this authority brutally, hoping to protect themselves. Others attempted to soften blows or bend rules quietly. But the structure itself forced prisoners into impossible choices: harm others or be harmed more severely. This system fractured solidarity. Trust became risky. Informants were everywhere. A careless word could result in punishment or death. Survival required vigilance, silence, and restraint. Resistance, when it occurred, had to be invisible. Time itself became distorted. Days blended together. Seasons were marked not by weather, but by mortality rates. Prisoners stopped counting weeks and began counting roll calls survived. The future narrowed to the next hour, the next task, the next breath. The SS relied on this psychological erosion. A prisoner who expected suffering was less likely to resist it. A population conditioned to fear became easier to manage. Control no longer required constant violence, only the threat of it backed by experience. Children, once again, were especially vulnerable. Their sense of normalcy was still forming. Some had known nothing but camps. Hunger, beatings, and death were not deviations from life, they were life. This robbed them not only of safety, but of a baseline against which injustice could be measured. Yet normalization never fully erased awareness. Prisoners knew this was wrong. They knew the system was designed to destroy them. That knowledge simmered beneath the surface, fueling quiet defiance. Small acts, sharing food, whispering news, helping the sick stand for roll call, became expressions of resistance precisely because cruelty had become routine. Some prisoners documented what they could: names, numbers, events, scraps of paper hidden in walls or buried in the ground. They understood that memory itself was a form of survival. If the camp succeeded in making cruelty normal, then remembering it as abnormal became a moral duty. The SS, too, were shaped by normalization. Many guards began their service unsettled by what they saw. Over time, exposure dulled reaction. Orders became easier to carry out. Language shifted. Prisoners were spoken of as units, threats, or burdens. Dehumanization was reinforced daily. This process revealed one of the most terrifying lessons of Buchenwald. Extreme cruelty does not always require fanaticism, can thrive in routine, in structure, in systems that reward obedience and discourage reflection. By the later years of the camp, suffering no longer needed justification. It simply existed. That was the success of the system. When cruelty becomes ordinary, it becomes invisible. And yet, even in this environment, the system never fully won. The very need to normalize cruelty revealed its fragility. A system that must constantly suppress empathy fears it. A system that relies on routine brutality knows that conscience, if awakened, could dismantle it. Buchenwald was not sustained by chaos alone. It was sustained by order, the wrong kind of order. One that stripped meaning from pain and treated destruction as administration. Understanding this is essential, because the most dangerous systems are not those that appear monstrous at first glance, but those that make monstrosity feel normal. Chapter by chapter, segment by segment, Buchenwald shows how suffering can be engineered, maintained, and made routine. And it warns us that the true collapse does not begin with violence, but with acceptance. The cruelty of Buchenwald did not scream every day. Most days it simply went to work. Chapter 7, Segment 1. Resistance behind barbed wire. The war against erasure. By the time Buchenwald entered the later years of the war, the SS believed the camp was fully under control. The systems of punishment, labor, starvation, and fear had been refined. Prisoners were exhausted, malnourished, and surrounded by informants. From the outside, resistance seemed impossible. And yet, beneath the surface of suffering, something dangerous to the SS was growing quietly and deliberately: organized resistance. Resistance at Buchenwald did not begin with weapons. It began with memory, communication, and coordination. The earliest acts were small and easily overlooked: whispered warnings, shared information, forged documents, and subtle acts of sabotage inside workshops. These actions were not dramatic, but they were essential. Every moment of survival beyond what the SS intended was already an act of defiance. Buchenwald's unique prisoner composition made resistance possible. Unlike extermination camps designed for immediate death, Buchenwald held a large population of political prisoners: communists, social democrats, trade unionists, intellectuals, and resistance fighters from across Europe. Many had prior experience organizing underground movements before their arrest. They understood secrecy, discipline, and patience. Inside the camp, those skills became weapons. The SS attempted to break political prisoners early, isolating leaders and executing organizers. But repression only forced resistance to adapt. Prisoners created decentralized networks, structured so that no single arrest could collapse the whole system. Cells operated independently, connected only through trusted intermediaries. Information moved slowly, carefully, and selectively. One of the most critical achievements of the resistance was infiltration of the camp administration. Through a combination of skill, deception, and opportunity, resistance members secured positions in the prisoner hierarchy: clerks, record keepers, block elders, and work assignment offices. From these positions, they could influence life and death decisions quietly. Names were removed from transport lists. Numbers were altered. Sick prisoners were reassigned to lighter labor. Children were hidden. Prisoners marked for execution sometimes disappeared into different barracks under false identities. None of this was guaranteed survival, but it shifted the odds, sometimes just enough. Information became another battlefield. News from the outside world, Allied advances, defeats of German armies, rumors of liberation, was priceless. Radios were strictly forbidden, but resistance members constructed secret receivers from scavenged parts. Listening was punishable by death. Still, the risk was taken. Knowledge restored a sense of time and future that the camp was designed to erase. This information did not spread recklessly. False hope could be deadly. Resistance leaders debated what to share and when. They understood that morale could collapse if rumors proved wrong. The goal was not optimism, it was preparedness. Sabotage inside armaments workshops was one of the most dangerous forms of resistance. Prisoners deliberately damaged weapons, misaligned components, and weakened materials while maintaining the appearance of productivity. Discovery meant immediate execution. Yet these acts continued, driven by the knowledge that every malfunction might save a life on the battlefield. Children and adolescents played unexpected roles. Too young for heavy labor but agile and observant, some became messengers, lookouts, or couriers. They moved between blocks carrying notes, warnings, and instructions concealed in clothing or objects. Their visibility made them vulnerable but also underestimated. The SS sensed resistance but struggled to isolate it. Interrogations intensified. Informants were encouraged. Punishments increased. Entire blocks were punished for individual acts. Yet repression could not fully extinguish what had become embedded into the camp's daily functioning. Importantly, resistance at Buchenwald was not only political or military, it was moral. Prisoners organized clandestine education sessions, teaching languages, mathematics, history, and ethics in whispered conversations after roll call. They preserved culture, dignity, and identity in a place designed to erase all three. Religious observances were held in secret. Songs were remembered. Stories were passed down. These acts affirmed humanity in an environment built on dehumanization. They reminded prisoners and their captors that the SS did not control everything. As the war turned against Germany, resistance networks shifted their focus. Liberation was no longer theoretical. The question became how to survive the final chaos. Camps were being evacuated. Death marches were increasing. Evidence was being destroyed. The resistance understood that the final phase might be the most dangerous. Plans were drawn up quietly. Weapons were hidden when possible. Guards were monitored. Maps were memorized. Communication lines between prisoner groups of different nationalities were strengthened. The goal was not open rebellion, not yet, but readiness. What made this resistance remarkable was not its scale, but its persistence. It survived starvation. It survived terror. It survived betrayal. It adapted constantly, knowing that one mistake could cost hundreds of lives. Buchenwald was built to break all opposition. Instead, it became a place where resistance learned to operate under absolute repression. Not loudly, not heroically in the traditional sense, but patiently, intelligently, and collectively. The SS believed fear guaranteed obedience. They underestimated something far more powerful: people who had nothing left to lose except each other. As the front lines crept closer and the sound of war grew louder beyond the barbed wire, the resistance inside Buchenwald prepared for a moment that few believed they would ever see. The moment when survival would no longer be enough. The moment when the camp itself would have to be taken back from within. Chapter 7, Segment 2. The Invisible Army. How resistance turned survival into strategy. As resistance inside Buchenwald matured, it evolved from scattered acts of defiance into something far more dangerous to the SS. An invisible, coordinated system operating within the very structure of the camp. This was not rebellion in the open. It was a long, methodical struggle fought through paperwork, logistics, and human relationships, using the camp's own machinery against itself. The SS believed control came from hierarchy. They established prisoner functionaries, block elders, capos, clerks, not realizing this system could be infiltrated. Resistance members understood early that power inside Buchenwald did not always come from weapons. Came from access, from lists, from schedules, from knowledge of who was arriving, who was sick, who was marked for transport, and who was no longer useful to the Reich. Through patience and calculated trust, resistance networks positioned their people in these roles. Not everywhere, not all at once, slowly. Each placement was debated, vetted, and approved in secrecy. The risk was enormous. A single exposure could unravel months of work. But success meant the ability to influence the flow of life and death invisibly. Transport lists were among the most critical targets. When prisoners were selected for evacuation, punishment, or transfer to extermination camps, resistance clerks sometimes altered names or numbers. A man marked for death might suddenly vanish from the list. Another, already dead, might replace him on paper. These changes were subtle, carefully balanced to avoid suspicion. Forgery became a weapon. Stamps were replicated. Forms were reused. Medical diagnoses were manipulated. Prisoners could be reclassified as essential specialists or temporarily unfit for transport. These delays often meant survival. In a system where timing decided fate, even a few days could change everything. Medical barracks became another center of resistance. Doctors and nurses, many of them prisoners, used their positions to hide the weak, misreport illnesses, and delay selections. They faced an impossible ethical burden, deciding who might survive if protected and who could not be saved. Every choice haunted them. But doing nothing meant surrendering everyone. The resistance also focused on intelligence. The SS did not operate in silence. Orders circulated. Rumors leaked. Guards talked. Resistance members listened carefully, piecing together fragments to anticipate danger. When evacuations were planned, warnings spread quietly. When executions were scheduled, people disappeared into different blocks. When searches were imminent, radios and documents vanished. The flow of information followed strict rules. Nothing was written unless absolutely necessary. Messages passed orally, often through multiple intermediaries who knew only fragments of the plan. Trust was earned slowly. Paranoia was a survival tool. No one knew the full structure. That was the point. One of the greatest threats to resistance was the camp system of informants. The SS recruited prisoners, often through coercion, to spy on others. Resistance leaders responded with extreme caution. Suspected informants were isolated socially. Information given to them was false or harmless. Direct confrontation was rare because violence would draw attention. Neutralization came through silence, not force. Despite these precautions, betrayals did occur. Arrests followed. Torture was routine. Prisoners were beaten, hanged, or shot as warnings. Entire barracks were punished collectively. Each crackdown tested the resistance's resilience. Yet it survived, adapting its structure after every loss. The resistance also understood the importance of unity across nationalities. Buchenwald held prisoners from dozens of countries, divided by language, culture, and SS-imposed hierarchy. The Nazis relied on these divisions. Resistance worked deliberately to bridge them. Translators were trained. Liaison prisoners connected groups. A shared enemy became a shared purpose. Children within the camp were among the most vulnerable and the most fiercely protected. Resistance members hid them in blocks designated for skilled labor or medical care. Older prisoners shared food, clothing, and knowledge. Some children were given false identities, passed off as older or assigned to less visible roles. Saving even one child was considered a victory against a system built to erase future generations. As the war turned decisively against Germany, resistance planning shifted again. Evacuations from other camps flooded Buchenwald with exhausted prisoners. Overcrowding intensified. Disease spread. The SS grew more brutal, more chaotic. Orders contradicted each other. Control began to fracture. The resistance recognized this instability as both danger and opportunity. They tracked SS movements. They counted guards. They noted which units were being transferred to the front. They watched weapons storage. They knew open revolt was impossible. But they prepared for a moment when authority might collapse. Hidden weapons were few: tools, knives, improvised clubs, a handful of firearms acquired through extraordinary risk. These were not enough to defeat the SS, but they were enough to assert control if the guards fled, or if an opportunity emerged during chaos. Morale became a strategic concern. Exhaustion and despair were as dangerous as bullets. Resistance members worked quietly to maintain discipline and purpose. They reminded prisoners to conserve strength, to stay alert, to survive not just for themselves, but for those who could not. They understood something the SS never fully grasped. Buchenwald was not only a camp. It was a society under siege. And like any society, it could organize, adapt, and resist, even under conditions designed to make resistance impossible. By early 1945, the sound of artillery was no longer distant rumor. The front was approaching. The SS began destroying records, accelerating executions, and preparing evacuations. The resistance knew the final phase had begun. What came next would decide whether Buchenwald ended as another silent grave, or as a place where prisoners seized the last fragment of control left to them. The invisible army had survived long enough. Now it faced its most dangerous test. Chapter 7, Segment 3. The moment before freedom, when resistance prepared to act. By the final weeks of the war, Buchenwald no longer functioned as a controlled system. It staggered like a collapsing structure, held together only by fear, habit, and the SS desperation to erase what they had built. For the underground resistance, this period was the most dangerous and the most decisive. Every decision now carried irreversible consequences. Too early, and the SS would crush them. Too late, and thousands would be marched to their deaths. The resistance had one overriding objective: prevent the total evacuation of the camp. They understood exactly what evacuation meant. Across Germany, camps were being emptied under gunpoint, prisoners forced onto death marches toward the interior of the Reich. Those who collapsed were shot. Those who survived the march often died anyway. If Buchenwald was fully evacuated, very few would live to see liberation. SS preparations became increasingly obvious. Roll calls grew longer and more frequent. Names were read out with growing speed and indifference. Entire blocks were ordered to assemble for transport with little warning. Columns of prisoners vanished through the gates, guarded by nervous, trigger-happy SS units. Each departure tightened the resistance's sense that time was running out. Inside the camp, communication moved constantly, quietly, relentlessly. Messengers traveled from block to block under the guise of routine labor. News spread without written words: which guards had left, which weapons stores had been moved, which SS officers had disappeared. The resistance began compiling its most dangerous information: counts of guards, locations of machine guns, patterns of patrols. They discovered something crucial. Many SS guards no longer believed in victory. Some were attempting to flee. Others drank heavily. Discipline was breaking down. Orders from Berlin contradicted local commands. Radios crackled with fragmented reports of Allied advances. The illusion of total control was cracking. But the SS was still capable of sudden violence. In the camp's final months, executions increased, not decreased. Prisoners suspected of sabotage or resistance were hanged publicly. Bodies were left on display as warnings. The SS wanted terror to outlive their authority. The resistance responded not with panic, but with restraint. Leaders issued a single overriding rule: no premature uprising, no isolated attacks, no emotional reactions. Survival now depended on discipline as strict as the SS, only guided by humanity rather than cruelty. Hidden weapons were distributed quietly, but sparingly. A few pistols, rifles taken from careless guards, tools sharpened into makeshift blades. These were not symbols of power. They were insurance meant only for a moment when authority collapsed completely. Meanwhile, the resistance prepared for another battle entirely. What would happen after liberation? They knew chaos could be just as deadly as captivity. Thousands were sick, starving, infected with typhus. A sudden flood of food could kill as many as it saved. Order would matter. Leadership would matter. The resistance began planning not just revolt, but transition. They selected men to maintain order, to guard SS prisoners if captured, to protect medical facilities, to manage food distribution. This was unprecedented. A prisoner organization planning to govern itself, even temporarily, inside a Nazi concentration camp. Children and the weakest prisoners were given special priority. Resistance members arranged hiding places, evacuation plans within the camp itself, and assigned guardians. The aim was simple: keep them alive until Allied forces arrived. As April 1945 approached, the sound of artillery grew unmistakable. The front was no longer theoretical. Shells could be heard at night. The SS reacted with frantic brutality. Orders came to evacuate remaining prisoners. Columns were assembled. Panic rippled through the camp. Then suddenly, something changed. SS guards began abandoning their posts. Watchtowers were left unmanned. Some officers fled in civilian clothing. Others destroyed documents and vanished. The machinery of terror, which had operated with ruthless precision for years, began to disintegrate in real time. The resistance understood immediately. This was the moment they had been waiting for. On April 11, 1945, as SS authority collapsed, resistance leaders gave the order they had prepared for in silence for years. Armed prisoners moved to seize control of the camp. Watchtowers were taken. Remaining guards were disarmed or captured. The SS flag was torn down. For the first time since Buchenwald's creation, the camp was no longer under Nazi control. When American troops arrived later that day, they did not find a camp in active operation. They found prisoners already in control, organized, armed, and determined to ensure that the truth could not be destroyed. Liberation had come, but not passively. It had been prepared. It had been earned. And it would not be forgotten. The next chapter begins not with freedom alone, but with reckoning. Chapter 8, Segment 1. Liberation. When the gates opened and the truth could no longer be hidden. On the afternoon of April 11, 1945, the gates of Buchenwald concentration camp stood open, but liberation did not arrive as a single moment of celebration. It arrived as shock, confusion, silence, and horror. When American forces approached the camp on Ettersberg Hill, they did not immediately understand what they were about to enter. Many had already seen destroyed towns and battlefields across Germany, but nothing had prepared them for what waited behind the barbed wire. Buchenwald was not a battlefield. It was a crime scene on a massive scale, frozen in the final moments of collapse. The air itself carried the stench of death. Smoke drifted from the crematorium. Thousands of skeletal men stared from behind fences, unsure whether the figures approaching were liberators or another deception meant to lure them into death. Inside the camp, the prisoner resistance had already seized control hours earlier, disarming remaining guards and raising a white flag. Yet even with the SS gone, fear lingered. Years of terror had taught prisoners that hope could be lethal. When the first American soldiers crossed the perimeter, they encountered a sight that stripped language from even hardened combat veterans. Emaciated survivors lay on bunks stacked 3 high, too weak to move. Others wandered aimlessly, their minds broken by years of violence and starvation. Piles of corpses lay unburied, some dead for days, others only hours. The crematorium revealed ovens still warm, lampshades made from human skin, shrunken heads preserved as trophies, and meticulously kept records of punishment and execution exposed the systematic nature of the crimes committed here. This was not chaos. It was organized cruelty. Doctors and medics immediately realized that liberation alone could kill. Starving prisoners could not simply be fed. Many suffered from advanced typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and severe malnutrition. Refeeding syndrome, unknown to most at the time, posed a deadly risk. Emergency hospitals were set up inside the camp itself. American medical personnel worked alongside surviving prisoner doctors, often improvising with limited supplies. Entire barracks were quarantined to prevent epidemics from spreading beyond the camp. For many prisoners, liberation came too late. Thousands died in the days and weeks after April 11th, their bodies unable to recover from years of deprivation. Liberation exposed not only suffering, but truth. Journalists and photographers were brought into Buchenwald almost immediately. Images of skeletal survivors, mass graves, and execution sites were documented and distributed worldwide. These images shattered any remaining illusions about Nazi camps as mere detention centers. American officers forced nearby German civilians to walk through the camp, to see what had been built in their name. Some denied knowledge. Others collapsed in tears. Many stood in silence. The evidence was undeniable. Buchenwald had not been an accident of war. It was a deliberate system of terror, labor, and slow death. Survivors were asked to testify almost immediately, even as many could barely stand. They named SS officers, described executions, medical experiments, and the internal hierarchy that had governed survival. These testimonies would later become foundational evidence in war crimes trials. For the prisoners, liberation was not the end of suffering. It was the beginning of memory. Many had lost entire families. Some had nowhere to go. Children who had survived in hiding emerged into a world without parents. Political prisoners faced uncertain futures in a shattered Europe. Jewish survivors confronted the reality that their communities had been erased. Yet amid the devastation, something extraordinary occurred. Survivors organized themselves once again, not under coercion, but with purpose. Committees formed to document crimes, care for the sick, and preserve evidence. They understood that the world might try to forget, minimize, or deny what had happened. Buchenwald, they insisted, must speak. And so it did. Liberation transformed Buchenwald from a place of hidden suffering into a symbol of exposure. What had been designed to break human beings now revealed the limits of terror. The SS had fled, but the camp remained. Its barracks, gallows, crematoria, and records standing as silent witnesses. April 11, 1945, did not erase Buchenwald. It forced it into history. The gates had opened, but the reckoning was only beginning. Chapter 8, Segment 2. Aftermath and Survival. The struggle to live after liberation. Liberation did not mean safety, and it did not mean peace. For the survivors of Buchenwald, April 11, 1945 marked the end of SS control, but it also marked the beginning of a new and deeply uncertain struggle: how to survive after years of systematic destruction. The camp remained a place of death long after the guards were gone. Thousands of prisoners were too weak to stand, too sick to speak, and too damaged to comprehend freedom. American forces quickly realized that Buchenwald was not merely a military objective. It was a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in real time. Emergency measures were imposed immediately. Barracks were converted into field hospitals. Entire sections of the camp were isolated due to rampant typhus and dysentery. Doctors worked around the clock, often with no medical history for their patients, no records of ages, and no understanding of how long each body had been starved. Many prisoners died simply because their organs could no longer function, even with care. Others died because they ate too quickly, their bodies unable to process nourishment after prolonged starvation. Liberation, for many, was followed by a quiet death on clean sheets instead of straw-covered bunks. Those who survived the first weeks faced another crisis: identity. Prisoners had been stripped of names, replaced by numbers, categories, and colored triangles. Now, suddenly, they were asked who they were, where they came from, and where they wished to go. For countless survivors, the answers no longer existed. Entire families had been erased. Towns had been destroyed. Borders had shifted. Many Jews discovered that their homes had been occupied or that returning would place them in danger once again. Political prisoners faced suspicion, especially those from Eastern Europe, where new regimes viewed former camp inmates as potential enemies. Children emerged from the camp without parents, some barely able to speak, having learned only the language of survival. Relief agencies arrived in waves. American military units, international aid organizations, and Jewish relief groups all attempted to bring order to chaos. Food distribution had to be carefully controlled. Clothing was issued to replace striped uniforms that had become symbols of dehumanization. Former prisoners were deloused, washed, and photographed, this time not for SS records, but for documentation and care. Slowly, names replaced numbers. Survivor lists were compiled. Notices were posted in multiple languages in hopes that someone might recognize a name, a hometown, or a face. These lists became walls of grief and fragile hope. At the same time, the camp itself became evidence. American authorities immediately ordered the preservation of Buchenwald as a crime scene. SS offices were searched. Documents were seized. Torture devices were catalogued. The crematorium, execution yards, and medical experiment rooms were photographed in detail. Survivors were interviewed while memories were still raw. Many spoke despite physical pain, understanding that testimony was now a form of resistance. They feared that without documentation, the truth would be buried alongside the dead. These testimonies described starvation rations calculated to weaken without killing too quickly, punishments designed to break the spirit, and forced labor quotas that treated human life as disposable fuel for the Nazi war economy. For the American soldiers stationed there, Buchenwald became a moral turning point. Many later testified that nothing they had seen in battle compared to what they witnessed inside the camp. Some soldiers struggled with rage, others with guilt for arriving too late. Orders were issued to bring local German civilians into the camp to confront the reality of what had existed nearby. They were forced to walk past corpses, barracks, and gallows. Some claimed ignorance. Others collapsed. The confrontation was deliberate. Denial was already anticipated. Survivors understood this instinctively. They spoke not only for themselves, but for those who had been silenced forever. As weeks passed, Buchenwald transformed again, from a site of suffering into a temporary city of the displaced. Cultural and religious life, suppressed for years, slowly reemerged. Survivors organized memorial services for the dead. Jewish prayers were spoken openly. Political prisoners held meetings to discuss rebuilding movements shattered by repression. Children were taught songs and stories, attempting to reclaim stolen childhoods. These acts were not signs of forgetting, they were acts of defiance against annihilation. Survival itself became a form of testimony. Yet trauma lingered everywhere. Nightmares haunted even those who appeared physically healed. The sounds of boots, dogs, or shouted orders could trigger panic. Freedom felt unreal, fragile, and reversible. Many survivors feared that history could repeat itself if memory faded. Buchenwald had shown how quickly civilization could collapse into cruelty when law, ideology, and obedience aligned against humanity. The aftermath was not a clean ending. It was a reckoning that stretched far beyond the camp's fences. Survivors carried Buchenwald with them into every future moment. Liberation saved lives, but it also imposed a burden. To remember, to testify, and to live in a world forever altered by what they had endured. Chapter 8, Segment 3. Memory, Justice, and the Long Shadow of Buchenwald. As the immediate crisis of survival slowly receded, Buchenwald entered a final and enduring phase, one that would last far longer than the camp itself ever existed. The struggle over memory, justice, and meaning. Liberation had exposed the crime, but exposure alone did not guarantee accountability. In the weeks following April 1945, the camp became a focal point not only for humanitarian aid, but for legal and moral reckoning. American authorities understood that Buchenwald was not an aberration, it was a system, and systems required judgment. Investigators gathered documents, photographs, and testimonies with urgency, aware that time would erode evidence and silence witnesses. Former SS guards and camp officials who had not fled were arrested and interrogated. Survivors were asked, again and again, to relive their suffering in precise detail. Names, dates, punishments, commands, faces. Many did so despite exhaustion and trauma, driven by the fear that if they did not speak now, the truth would be diluted, denied, or forgotten. These testimonies formed the backbone of the Dachau trials, where Buchenwald's crimes were prosecuted under American military law. For the first time, the world heard systematic descriptions of forced labor to death, medical experiments conducted without consent, arbitrary executions disguised as discipline, and starvation used as a weapon. Defendants often claimed they were following orders, repeating the language of obedience that had enabled the camp to function. The trials rejected that defense. Responsibility, the court argued, did not vanish inside a uniform. Some perpetrators were sentenced to death, others to long imprisonment. For survivors, the verdicts brought mixed emotions. Justice was visible, but it was incomplete. No sentence could restore the dead, undo the years stolen, or heal bodies permanently damaged by hunger and violence. Justice, they learned, was necessary, but it was not closure. Meanwhile, Buchenwald itself did not disappear. After the war, the camp fell into a new and complicated chapter under Soviet control, where it was repurposed as a special camp for political prisoners. This uncomfortable continuity blurred the lines between victim and oppressor in post-war memory and complicated efforts to memorialize the site. Some survivors struggled with the idea that the ground of their suffering was once again being used for imprisonment, even under a different regime. Others feared that the specific crimes of Nazism would be obscured by Cold War politics. Memory, it became clear, was not neutral. It was shaped by power, ideology, and time. In the decades that followed, survivors scattered across the world. Some rebuilt lives in Europe, others emigrated to Israel, the United States, or elsewhere. Many never spoke publicly about Buchenwald, carrying the camp within them in silence. Others dedicated their lives to education, testimony, and remembrance. They visited schools, spoke at trials, recorded oral histories, and returned to the campsite to confront the past directly. Each testimony was an act of resistance against denial. Each memory shared was a refusal to allow Buchenwald to become an abstract statistic rather than a human tragedy. Memorialization evolved slowly. It took years before Buchenwald was formally recognized not just as a historical location, but as a moral warning. Museums, monuments, and educational programs were eventually established to preserve the truth of what had happened on Ettersberg Hill. These memorials did not glorify suffering, they documented it. They showed how a modern state used bureaucracy, discipline, and labor to destroy human beings gradually, efficiently, and legally. Buchenwald became a symbol not of instant death, but of prolonged cruelty, proof that genocide does not always arrive with gas chambers, but can be built through policies that normalize dehumanization day by day. The legacy of Buchenwald also reshaped international law. The documentation of crimes committed there contributed to the development of human rights frameworks and the principle that crimes against humanity have no statute of limitations. The camp stood as evidence that moral collapse could occur inside advanced societies, not just distant battlefields. For future generations, Buchenwald became a case study in how ordinary systems, labor, discipline, punishment, administration, could be weaponized when stripped of ethics. Even today, the shadow of Buchenwald remains long. Its lessons are uncomfortable because they implicate not only perpetrators, but bystanders, administrators, and institutions that allowed suffering to continue. The camp warns that cruelty does not require chaos. It can thrive in order. It reminds us that endurance can coexist with unimaginable pain, and that survival does not erase trauma. Buchenwald's history does not end with liberation, trials, or memorials. It continues wherever human dignity is threatened, wherever people are reduced to numbers, and wherever obedience is valued more than conscience. Remembering Buchenwald is not an act of looking backward, It is an obligation to the present. The camp was designed to make suffering last. Memory exists to make its warning endure. Chapter 9, Segment 1. Death Marches. When the camp moved on foot. As the Third Reich collapsed in early 1945, Buchenwald entered one of its most lethal phases, not because new systems were built, but because the existing ones were set into motion beyond the barbed wire. With Allied armies advancing rapidly from both east and west, the SS leadership issued orders that would turn prisoners themselves into moving evidence to be destroyed. Evacuation. Camps were not to be liberated. They were to be emptied. For Buchenwald, this meant death marches, forced evacuations carried out under conditions designed to kill through exhaustion, exposure, hunger, and bullets. Beginning in late March and accelerating through April, tens of thousands of prisoners were driven out of the camp in columns guarded by SS men and auxiliary forces, ordered to march south and east through collapsing Germany. These were not organized transfers. They were chaotic expulsions carried out with minimal food, no medical care, and brutal enforcement. Prisoners already weakened by years of starvation and forced labor were ordered to walk for days and weeks, often barefoot or in rags, through cold rain, snow, and bombed-out villages. Those who stumbled were beaten. Those who collapsed were shot at the roadside. Bodies were left where they fell, warnings to those still walking. Civilians along the routes witnessed skeletal figures moving through their towns under armed guard, a vision that shattered any remaining illusion about what the camps had been. The marches were deliberately unrecorded. No manifests, no destinations that mattered. The goal was not relocation, it was attrition. SS guards, increasingly fearful and undisciplined, acted with open cruelty, sometimes killing prisoners arbitrarily, sometimes abandoning entire columns when Allied troops drew near, leaving survivors to scatter or die. Some guards fled, discarding uniforms and weapons, while prisoners struggled onward, unsure whether stopping meant freedom or execution. Along these routes, mass graves appeared in forests, fields, and roadside ditches, often dug by prisoners moments before being shot. Entire columns vanished into the countryside. For many, the death march was deadlier than years inside Buchenwald itself. Survival depended on chance, physical resilience, and the rare intervention of civilians who risked punishment by offering food, water, or shelter. Others survived only because guards disappeared, leaving them to hide until Allied forces arrived. By the time American troops reached Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, more than half of the camp's prisoner population had already been driven away. What remained inside the camp, those too sick to march, those hidden by resistance networks, and those deliberately left behind, represented only a fraction of the people who had passed through its gates. The death marches extended Buchenwald's killing zone far beyond its fences, transforming roads and villages into part of the camp's geography. Liberation, when it came, was therefore incomplete and uneven. Some prisoners were freed at the camp itself. Others were liberated days or weeks later along march routes. Many never lived to see either. The marches revealed the final logic of the system. Even when defeat was inevitable, the machinery of cruelty continued to operate, fueled by ideology, fear, and habit. Buchenwald did not end with a single moment of liberation. It dissolved violently into the landscape, scattering its victims across a dying Reich. The death marches stand as proof that Nazi terror did not require infrastructure to function. When the camp could no longer hold its prisoners, the system simply put them on the road and let death follow on foot. Chapter 9, Segment 2. Liberation Interrupted. What the Americans found, and what was missing. When American forces reached Buchenwald in April 1945, they arrived not at a functioning camp, but at the shattered remains of a system already in flight. The SS had not waited for the Allies to arrive before acting. Days earlier, much of the camp's population had been forced onto the death marches, leaving behind a place that was both eerily quiet and overwhelmingly horrific. What U.S. troops encountered was not the full scale of Buchenwald's crime, but its residue, evidence stripped of context, suffering frozen in time, and survivors barely clinging to life. As American soldiers advanced toward Ettersberg Hill, they first encountered abandoned guard posts and defensive positions hastily vacated by fleeing SS units. Inside the camp perimeter, the scene defied comprehension. Barracks built to house hundreds contained thousands of skeletal men lying on bunks or the floor, too weak to stand, many too weak to speak. Typhus and dysentery raged unchecked. The smell of decay was inescapable. Corpses lay stacked near barracks, in courtyards, and beside crematoria that had been unable to keep pace with death. For soldiers trained for combat, not humanitarian catastrophe, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. Many had never imagined that a place like this could exist, let alone be administered deliberately by a modern state. Yet even as the Americans documented what they saw, they quickly realized that the camp they were liberating was incomplete. Tens of thousands of prisoners were missing, driven away days earlier under SS guard. Liberation had arrived late for them. Inside Buchenwald, survivors spoke of columns forced out at gunpoint, of friends shot along the roads, of march routes that led nowhere. The camp's internal resistance network, which had secretly sabotaged SS orders and hidden weapons, played a crucial role in preventing total annihilation before liberation. Prisoner leaders delayed evacuations where possible, hid the sick, and in the final hours before U.S. arrival, took control of parts of the camp after the last SS guards fled. This resistance ensured that at least some prisoners survived to be freed on sight. American medics and officers immediately faced a new crisis: how to keep survivors alive. Starved bodies could not simply be fed. Refeeding syndrome, when weakened bodies shut down after sudden nourishment, threatened to kill those who had endured years of deprivation. Emergency hospitals were established. German civilians from nearby Weimar were forced to walk through the camp and witness what had been done in their name. Many claimed ignorance. Others wept. The evidence made denial impossible. Meanwhile, Allied forces began tracking down SS personnel who had abandoned the camp or attempted to blend into civilian populations. Some were captured nearby. Others escaped temporarily. The liberation of Buchenwald thus became not a single moment of rescue, but the beginning of a chaotic transition, from imprisonment to survival, from secrecy to exposure, from terror to testimony. For the survivors, freedom did not immediately mean safety. Disease, trauma, and loss followed them long after the gates opened. Many had no homes to return to, no families left alive. Buchenwald's liberation exposed only a fragment of the camp's history. The rest had been scattered across Germany's roads, forests, and villages through the death marches. American documentation teams photographed bodies, recorded testimony, and preserved physical evidence, understanding that what they were seeing would soon be contested, denied, or minimized. Buchenwald became one of the first camps whose horrors were systematically recorded by the liberators, shaping global understanding of Nazi crimes. Yet even these records could not fully capture what had already vanished: the thousands who died after leaving the gates unmarked and uncounted. Liberation revealed the truth, but it also revealed absence. A camp emptied by fear, murder, and flight. Buchenwald did not end neatly. It unraveled, and what the Americans found was not the end of suffering, but proof of how close the system had come to erasing its victims entirely. Chapter 9, Segment 3. From Evidence to Judgment. Testimony, Trials, and the Struggle for Truth. After the liberation of Buchenwald, the camp ceased to function as a site of imprisonment, but it immediately became something else: a crime scene. What had once been hidden behind barbed wire and euphemistic language now stood exposed, and the world faced a new question: not what had happened, but what would be done about it. American forces moved quickly to document Buchenwald in meticulous detail, understanding that memory alone would never be enough. Photographs were taken of bodies stacked near barracks, of emaciated survivors, of instruments of punishment, of crematoria and execution sites. Officers ordered written reports. Doctors compiled medical evidence. Engineers mapped the camp's layout. Everything that could testify to the reality of the crimes was preserved, because even in April 1945, there was an awareness that denial would come. The SS had attempted to destroy records, evacuate witnesses, and erase evidence, but the scale of the crime made total concealment impossible. Survivors were interviewed as soon as their health allowed. Many spoke haltingly, weakened by starvation and illness, yet determined to leave a record of what they had endured. They described beatings, executions, forced labor, medical experiments, and the daily terror that defined life inside the camp. For some, speaking was as painful as silence, but testimony became an act of resistance after survival. Their words would later form the backbone of war crimes prosecutions. Buchenwald soon played a central role in the legal reckoning that followed the war. The Dachau trials, conducted by U.S. military tribunals, included cases against SS personnel who had served at Buchenwald and its subcamps. Guards, doctors, and administrators were charged with murder, torture, and crimes against humanity. Unlike the later Nuremberg trials, which focused on high-ranking Nazi leadership, these proceedings addressed the individuals who carried out terror on the ground. Survivors testified in court, sometimes facing their former captors across the courtroom. The psychological weight of these confrontations was immense. Some defendants claimed they had merely followed orders. Others denied knowledge. The tribunals rejected these defenses, establishing a crucial precedent. Obedience was not absolution. Participation in systematic cruelty carried personal responsibility. Yet justice was uneven. Some perpetrators escaped capture. Others received sentences that survivors felt were far too lenient. As Cold War priorities shifted, prosecutions slowed. Many SS members reintegrated into post-war society, their pasts obscured or minimized. For survivors, this partial justice was deeply painful. Liberation had promised accountability, but the reality was compromise. At the same time, Buchenwald's physical space entered a new and complex phase. After the war, the camp fell within the Soviet occupation zone. Portions of it were reused by Soviet authorities as a detention facility, further complicating the site's history and memory. This overlapping legacy would later fuel political tensions about how Buchenwald should be remembered and interpreted. Despite these challenges, survivor organizations fought relentlessly to preserve the camp as a memorial. They understood that without a physical site, denial and distortion would flourish. Over decades, Buchenwald became a place of remembrance, education, and warning. Memorials were erected. Museums were established. Names of victims were recorded where possible. Yet even today, Buchenwald remains a symbol not only of Nazi cruelty, but of how difficult it is to confront uncomfortable truth. The camp's story challenges myths about civilization, progress, and morality. It forces societies to ask how ordinary institutions, law, medicine, industry, bureaucracy, can be transformed into tools of destruction. For survivors, the struggle did not end with liberation or trials. Many lived with lifelong trauma, health complications, and the burden of memory. They became witnesses not by choice, but by survival. Their voices shaped Holocaust education worldwide, ensuring that Buchenwald would not fade into abstraction. This final phase of Buchenwald's history, documentation, judgment, remembrance, reveals a sobering reality. Justice is never complete. Memory is always contested, and the work of bearing witness never truly ends. The camp was designed to break bodies and erase identities. That it failed completely is due not to systems or courts alone, but to the survivors who refused silence. Buchenwald's legacy lives not only in ruins and archives, but in the enduring insistence that what happened there must be known, named, and remembered, because forgetting would mean allowing the crime to succeed after the fact. Chapter 10, Segment 1. The meaning of Buchenwald, memory, responsibility, and the warning it left behind. When the barbed wire of Buchenwald finally fell silent, the camp did not end. Changed form. What had once been a functioning mechanism of terror became a question that would follow the world into the future. How could this have happened, and what must be done to ensure it never happens again? Buchenwald was not built in secrecy on the edge of civilization. It was constructed in the heart of Germany, near Weimar, the city of poets, philosophers, and culture. Its existence shattered the illusion that barbarism grows only in distant or lawless places. Instead, it proved that modern, educated societies are fully capable of engineering suffering when ideology replaces humanity and obedience replaces conscience. The legacy of Buchenwald, therefore, extends far beyond its physical boundaries. It is not only a memorial to victims, but a mirror held up to civilization itself. In the decades after the war, Germany and the wider world struggled to define what Buchenwald should represent. Early narratives focused on liberation and victory, but survivors insisted that remembrance must center the victims, not the liberators. The camp became a place of pilgrimage for former prisoners, families, historians, and students. Each visit carried a heavy question. What responsibility do the living have toward the dead? Memorialization was not immediate or uncontested. Political divisions shaped how the camp was interpreted, especially during the Cold War, when memory itself became a battlefield. Yet despite these tensions, Buchenwald endured as a site of truth. Its barracks, execution sites, and crematoria were preserved not to shock, but to teach. Education became the camp's final function. The stories of those imprisoned there, political dissidents, Jews, children, Roma, resistance fighters, and countless others, were woven into curricula, exhibitions, and survivor testimonies. These narratives dismantled simplistic explanations of evil. They revealed that terror did not arrive overnight. It was constructed step by step, through laws that excluded, language that dehumanized, systems that rewarded cruelty, and silence that allowed it all to continue. Buchenwald demonstrated that suffering could be prolonged deliberately, that death did not need gas chambers to be systematic, and that bureaucracy could kill just as effectively as weapons. Survivors often spoke of Buchenwald not as a singular horror, but as a warning encoded in human behavior. Many emphasized that the camp's guards were not monsters in appearance. They were trained, uniformed men following routines, convinced or pretending to be convinced that they were performing necessary duties. This realization unsettles easy moral distance. It forces a confrontation with the conditions under which ordinary people accept extraordinary cruelty. Buchenwald teaches that the danger lies not only in hatred, but in normalization. When violence becomes routine, when suffering is reduced to numbers, when language hides reality behind euphemism, mass atrocity becomes possible without constant visible brutality. This lesson resonates long after the last survivor. In modern times, as genocide denial, distortion, and relativization continue to surface, Buchenwald stands as an anchor of documented truth. Its records, photographs, testimonies, and physical remains counter attempts to rewrite history. But memory alone is not enough. The camp's legacy demands active responsibility. Remembrance without reflection risks becoming ritual without meaning. Buchenwald asks each generation to examine its own systems of power, exclusion, and obedience. It warns that injustice does not require extremism to begin, only apathy, fear, and the gradual erosion of empathy. The camp also reshaped international law and moral frameworks. Concepts such as crimes against humanity, accountability beyond borders, and the rejection of just following orders were forged in response to places like Buchenwald. These principles remain fragile. They require constant defense. Survivors often said that the true memorial to those who died would not be stone monuments, but vigilance. To remember Buchenwald is to recognize warning signs before they harden into systems. It is to understand that human dignity can be dismantled quietly, administratively, and legally long before violence becomes visible. The final meaning of Buchenwald does not lie only in what happened there, but in what the world chooses to do with that knowledge. The camp was designed to erase individuality, to reduce people to labor units and disposable bodies. By preserving their stories, names, and experiences, humanity denies the camp its ultimate goal. Buchenwald remains a place of endless suffering, but also of enduring testimony. It stands as proof that survival can become resistance, memory can become justice, and truth, once spoken, cannot be fully buried again. Chapter 10, Segment 2. From Camp to Courtroom, Justice, Silence, and the Struggle to Hold Perpetrators Accountable. When the gates of Buchenwald closed behind the liberated prisoners, a new and deeply uncertain phase began. Not only for the survivors, but for the world that now stood exposed to what the camp represented. Liberation did not bring immediate justice. Instead, it opened a long, uneven struggle between memory and denial, accountability and evasion. The question was no longer what had happened inside Buchenwald, but who would be held responsible and how. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Allied forces moved quickly to document the camp. American military photographers captured images of corpses, barracks, crematoria, and survivors whose bodies bore the unmistakable marks of starvation and abuse. These images were not taken for history books alone. They were evidence, gathered in anticipation of trials that would attempt to impose law on crimes that seemed beyond comprehension. Former SS guards and administrators were arrested, interrogated, and confronted with the physical reality of what they had overseen. Some claimed ignorance. Others insisted they had followed orders. Many attempted to minimize their roles, describing themselves as minor functionaries trapped within a larger system. But Buchenwald itself contradicted these defenses. The camp structure made clear that terror was not accidental. It was organized, managed, and enforced at every level. The Dachau trials, which included prosecutions related to Buchenwald, marked one of the first efforts to confront this reality in a courtroom. For the first time, guards, doctors, and officials were forced to answer not only for individual acts of violence, but for participation in a system designed to destroy human beings. Survivors testified about beatings, executions, forced labor, and medical abuse. Their words transformed suffering into legal record. Yet even as verdicts were handed down, justice remained incomplete. Many perpetrators escaped prosecution entirely, blending back into civilian life or benefiting from post-war priorities that shifted focus from accountability to reconstruction and Cold War politics. As years passed, silence began to replace urgency. In West Germany, public discussion of camps like Buchenwald was often avoided. The focus turned toward economic recovery, while former Nazis reintegrated into society with minimal scrutiny. In East Germany, Buchenwald was memorialized, but selectively. The camp was framed primarily as a site of communist martyrdom, sidelining Jewish suffering and other victim groups. Memory became political, shaped by ideology rather than truth. This distortion did not erase Buchenwald's history, but it fractured it. Survivors found themselves fighting a second battle, not for survival but for recognition. Many struggled with trauma in a world eager to move on. Their testimonies were sometimes dismissed as exaggerated or inconvenient. The psychological wounds inflicted by the camp did not heal with liberation. Nightmares, guilt, and silence followed survivors for decades. For some, speaking about Buchenwald was unbearable. For others, it became a moral obligation. As time passed and new generations emerged, renewed efforts were made to confront the past honestly. Later trials, historical commissions, and archival research began to expose how deeply the camp system had been embedded in German society. Buchenwald was no longer viewed as an aberration, but as a logical outcome of policies that dehumanized entire groups. This shift mattered. It reframed responsibility from a handful of sadists to a broader network of enablers. Officials who signed documents, companies that profited from forced labor, doctors who conducted experiments, and citizens who looked away. Justice, it became clear, was not only about punishment. It was about acknowledgement. Memorials were expanded, exhibitions revised, and educational programs developed to present a fuller picture of the camp's history. Names were restored to victims once reduced to numbers. Forgotten groups, children, Roma, homosexual prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses were finally recognized. This process was slow and often resisted, but it marked a crucial evolution in how Buchenwald was understood. The camp's legacy was no longer confined to national history. It became part of a global conversation about human rights, genocide prevention, and the limits of obedience. International law drew lessons from camps like Buchenwald, reinforcing the principle that crimes against humanity are punishable regardless of rank or justification. Yet even these advances remain fragile. Denial, distortion, and relativization continue to surface, challenging the hard-won truths established by survivors and historians. In this sense, the struggle for justice did not end with verdicts. It continues wherever history is questioned, minimized, or weaponized. Buchenwald's courtrooms and memorials serve as reminders that silence favors perpetrators, not victims. The camp's story warns that without sustained effort, accountability erodes and memory fades. Justice delayed can become justice denied, not only for those who suffered, but for the societies that must learn from their suffering. To confront Buchenwald honestly is to accept uncomfortable truths, that legal systems can be slow, that societies can prioritize convenience over morality, and that the line between past and present responsibility is thinner than many would like to believe. The camp's legacy within the realm of justice is therefore incomplete by design. It was never meant to offer closure. Instead, it leaves behind an open demand that each generation decide whether the crimes of the past will be remembered as warnings or buried as inconveniences. Chapter 10, Segment 3. The Lasting Shadow of Buchenwald. Memory, Warning, and the Duty of Remembrance. Long after the barbed wire rusted and the watchtowers fell silent, Buchenwald did not end. It followed the survivors into their dreams, into their silence, into the moral foundations of the post-war world. The camp became more than a historical site. It became a test of memory itself. How societies choose to remember Buchenwald would shape not only how the past was understood, but how future violence would be recognized, resisted, or ignored. In the decades following liberation, the physical grounds of the camp were transformed into a memorial, but remembrance was never simple. The soil itself carried contradictions. Buchenwald had been both a place of systematic cruelty and a site where prisoners organized resistance, protected children, and preserved fragments of humanity under unimaginable pressure. Any honest memory had to hold both truths at once: absolute victimization and extraordinary moral courage. Yet remembrance is rarely neutral. In East Germany, Buchenwald was turned into a symbol of anti-fascist triumph, emphasizing communist resistance while downplaying the camp's role in the Holocaust and the suffering of Jews and other persecuted groups. In the West, the camp was often overshadowed by places like Auschwitz, treated as part of a broader narrative rather than examined in its own right. These selective memories did not erase Buchenwald, but they narrowed it, flattening a complex reality into politically convenient forms. Over time, survivors aged, and with them went voices that could speak from lived experience rather than archives. This loss made the responsibility of remembrance heavier, not lighter. Historians, educators, and memorial curators faced a profound challenge: how to preserve the truth of a place designed to destroy truth itself. Buchenwald had been built to break people physically and psychologically, to reduce them to labor units and then dispose of them. Remembering such a system required more than listing crimes. It required explaining how ordinary administrative routines, roll calls, work assignments, medical inspections became tools of terror. It required confronting the fact that Buchenwald functioned not in chaos, but in order. This is what makes its legacy so dangerous. The camp demonstrates how cruelty can be normalized, regulated, and justified through language, hierarchy, and routine. Guards were trained to see prisoners not as individuals but as categories. Bureaucrats measured productivity while bodies collapsed from hunger. Doctors recorded experiments as data while patients died on tables. None of this relied on constant rage. Much of it relied on obedience, careerism, and silence. Buchenwald stands as evidence that genocide does not require monsters alone. It requires systems that reward compliance and punish empathy. This is why the camp remains relevant far beyond its historical boundaries. Around the world, memorials now emphasize Buchenwald not only as a site of Nazi crime, but as a warning. Educational programs focus on the gradual erosion of rights, the labeling of undesirables, the role of propaganda, and the transformation of neighbors into informants. These lessons are uncomfortable because they implicate societies, not just regimes. They force audiences to ask how easily fear can be manipulated, how quickly exclusion can become policy, and how slow outrage can be when injustice targets the marginalized. Survivors often spoke of this responsibility in stark terms. Many said they did not survive to be remembered as victims alone, but to testify. Their memories were not meant to evoke pity, but vigilance. Never again, they warned, was not a slogan. It was a demand that required constant effort. Yet the passage of time has tested this resolve. As first-hand witnesses disappear, denial and distortion find new space. Conspiracy theories, historical relativism, and attempts to equate perpetrators with victims threaten to hollow out the meaning of camps like Buchenwald. Each act of denial is not merely an insult to the dead. It is a step toward repeating the conditions that made the camp possible. The physical memorial at Buchenwald today is intentionally stark. It does not overwhelm with spectacle. Instead, it confronts visitors with absence. Empty barracks, preserved ovens, silent courtyards where thousands once stood at roll call. This absence is deliberate. It mirrors the void left behind by those who were murdered, worked to death, or vanished on death marches. It asks visitors to fill that silence not with comfort, but with responsibility. To remember Buchenwald is to accept that progress is fragile, that rights can be revoked, and that violence often arrives disguised as necessity. The camp's final legacy is not contained in stone markers or museum panels. It lives in how societies respond to dehumanization today, how they speak about refugees, prisoners, minorities, and political opponents. Buchenwald teaches that the line between exclusion and annihilation is not as wide as we want to believe. It shows how quickly suffering can be rationalized when it serves ideology or convenience. And it reminds us that the most dangerous moment is not when violence is loud, but when it becomes routine. In the end, Buchenwald does not ask to be remembered out of obligation alone. It demands remembrance as an act of defense, against forgetting, against denial, and against the quiet return of ideas that once turned a forest near Weimar into a factory of human destruction. The camp is gone, but its warning remains. Whether that warning is heard, honored, or ignored is not a matter of history. It is a matter of choice. As this documentary comes to a close, we leave Buchenwald not with answers that bring comfort, but with truths that demand responsibility. What happened here was not the result of chaos or madness alone, but of systems carefully built, maintained, and obeyed. Buchenwald reminds us that cruelty does not always arrive suddenly. It grows step by step, normalized through silence, fear, and routine. The men, women, and children who suffered here were not numbers, not categories, not shadows. They were human beings whose lives mattered, whose memories endure beyond the fences that once confined them. To remember Buchenwald is not only to look back, but to look inward, to recognize how easily dignity can be stripped away, and how vital it is to defend it wherever it is threatened. May this story stay with you, not as a source of despair, but as a warning and a responsibility. Because remembrance is not passive. It is an act of vigilance. And in remembering, we honor those who were lost by refusing to forget what must never be allowed to happen again.